He saluted and loudly said, "I promise to complete the mission." Admiral Myers nodded. The military had a deeper level of consideration for this military exercise, which was why he and Zhou Yingxing had suddenly come to the base after the military exercise. However, even if it was to achieve that strategic objective, they could not let Du Shaoqing personally command. As the Federation's most promising Major General, using him to spar with these cadets was really like using the main cannon of a battleship to fight mecha. It was a bit of a mountain out of a molehill, and it was also a form of disrespect to Division Commander Du Shaoqing. Defense Minister Zhou Yingxing stood calmly beside General Miles, not saying a word. From the moment he had appeared, Su Lu had been staring at him, thinking about how he had forced Du Shaoqing to the point where he could not flip out. He could not help but feel that life was really strange. Just as he was thinking of taking the blame for his father-in-law, this person really came to take the blame for him. Thinking too much, Su Lu only came back to his senses when he heard Shimin Jin promise to complete the mission. His lips parted slightly, and his eyes subconsciously narrowed. From the beginning until now, it seemed like no one had asked for his opinion. It should be known that if such a small-scale military exercise was really designed, the person who would be piloting the MX to attack the opposing division would be him. However, even Du Shaoqing had no choice but to temporarily restrain his coldness and arrogance in front of the federal military's will. How could he object? With just one sentence from General Miles, the base, which had already become quiet, began to bustle again. The staff officers of the 1st Military Region's Staff Officer Unit once again returned to the Military Exercise Command Hall and began to design and adjust the military exercise data model. They were so busy that they did not even have time to eat dinner. As these staff officers designed the military exercise plan, they also felt that it was hilarious and ridiculous, using 8 MX mechas to attack an entire battalion. With this sort of power difference, no matter how perfect the Military Exercise Command Center's plan was, it would not be able to achieve a complete balance. Most of the participating troops had already left the base on military aircraft. The main forces of the Iron 7 Division had already embarked on their journey back to System S3. In today's military exercise, the MX Mecha had already demonstrated their formidable combat prowess. If this had been a normal military exercise, the staff officers might have really believed that these 8 MX Mecha would be able to take down an entire battalion's defensive line. But the problem was that the last battalion left in the base was the Iron 7 Division's most ferocious all-mecha defense battalion. All the officers of the Federation knew that the strength of the Iron 7 Division was mainly due to Division Commander Shaoqing, followed by a group of outstanding officers led by Shimin Jin, and the most ferocious of all was the All-Mecha Defense Battalion. In many military exercises in the past, the Iron 7 Division had never mobilized the defense battalion by the division commander's side. Once this battalion was mobilized, it meant that the other side had indeed performed extremely well. But at the same time, the military exercise was about to end. The Iron 7 Division's defense battalion was nominally an entire battalion, but in reality, if you included the mechanical repair company and the individual logistics system, this battalion was extremely overstaffed. When these military staff officers had nothing to do, they had done some calculations on their combat power. If the Iron 7 Division's defense battalion was fully mobilized, they would actually have the combat power of an independent regiment. The time for this sudden small-scale military exercise was set for the next morning. However, the military staff officers busied themselves for half the night and still couldn't come up with a plan for the military exercise. This was because in the past military exercises, there had never been such a strange design. After a long time of frustration, the staff officers of the Military Exercise Command Center decided to revise the original plan. After consulting with their superiors, they added in a data simulation. With the help of the Federal Central Computer, they designed their own virtual military force. Only then did they barely manage to pass the military exercise plan. One side of the military exercise was the Iron 7 Division's defense battalion and a virtual support team. The other side was the virtual battalion commanded by the officer cadets and the 8 MX mechas led by Su Lu. While the staff officers were busy, Su Lu and the officer cadets were eating dinner in the cafeteria of the base. After the sudden confrontation in the afternoon, the members of Team 7, who called themselves the 17 Mechanics, had already shed their initial suspicion and uneasiness towards Su Lu. Under the lead of Xiong Linquan, they clamored and yelled as they sat at his table. As for the other officer cadets, their impression of instructor Xiao Su had also undergone a fundamental change. They all sat at the table beside him with smiles on their faces. Thus, the scene in the cafeteria was very interesting. With Su Li's table as the center, 50 to 60 soldiers sat neatly in a circle. Although everyone had smiles on their faces, those smiles were actually very forced. Tomorrow morning, these officer cadets would once again walk onto the simulated battlefield of the military exercise, and Su Lu would have to lead the 8 MX mechas to complete that seemingly impossible mission. Today, the military transferred 3 mechanics over. Although the 2 reserve divisions are only used to set up the simulated battlefield and exert pressure, they can't be deployed to the lonely mountain area. But after all, we are commanding 3 divisions. If we lost so badly against the Iron 7 Division, I have even less confidence in commanding tomorrow morning. Zhou Yu put down the utensils in his hands and said with a complicated expression, Commander Du's tactical deduction has no loopholes. Although Shimin Jin will be commanding tomorrow, in reality, the Iron 7 Division is still his division regardless of whether he is there or not. I can't find any loopholes in their plan. As for the surprise attack by the MX mechas, if it was a true surprise attack, perhaps there would be some chance of success. But this impromptu military exercise has already clearly indicated that you are going to launch a surprise attack, so the other side will definitely be prepared to deal with it. There is no way we can succeed in this kind of ridiculous military exercise. Su Lu lowered his head and ate silently, not saying a word. He could feel the atmosphere in the cafeteria. The officer cadets had never had the experience of commanding a large unit by themselves, especially freshly graduated students like Zhou Yu. No matter how talented he was, the gap between him and instructor Du Shaoqing could not be closed. At this time, everyone no longer had much confidence in themselves. After General Miles somewhat unreasonably confirmed the impromptu military exercise, Su Lu noticed that Du Shaoqing was looking at him coldly. With his ability to judge people's hearts, he actually felt a trace of murderous intent. The burning zhenqi in his body immediately began to circulate, becoming extremely sensitive. Su Li's mood was somewhat gloomy and slightly angry. Although Du Shaoqing had not been able to fly into a rage today, which had caused him to lose face, and because of Park Ji-ho and other matters, it was difficult for him to coexist peacefully with the Iron 7 Division. But the other party had actually wanted to kill him. This made him feel incomprehensible and uneasy. Just as he was about to comfort the student who was forcing a smile, he saw Secretary Jiao walk in and use his eyes to signal for him to follow him out. Minister Zhou wants to see you. Secretary Jiao had met Su Lu a few times and was no stranger to him. He also knew that the person in front of him often went in and out of the Shishan Zhou family. Su Lu was slightly startled. He did not understand why Minister Zhou wanted to see him at such a tense time before the military exercise. Was he not afraid of the speculation and discussion within the military? Sit. In the high-rise suite of the training base, Zhou Yingxing took off the glasses on the bridge of his nose and calmly waved his hand at Su Lu, indicating that he should sit on the sofa beside the bed. This big shot who had suddenly risen to power in the Federation, whether it was in charge of logistics in the General Assembly base, or cautiously holding his tail between his legs as the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of National Defense, or now that he had become a real big shot with great power in the federal military, his expression was always so calm and peaceful. There was not the slightest change because of his rise in rank and power. Su Lu sat down and looked at Zhou Yingxing in front of him. He suddenly thought of a year ago at the Milky Way Public Cemetery when they first met. They should not have been familiar with each other, but because of the black pot, they became familiar with each other. Looking at the white hair on Zhou Yingxing's mane, Su Lu felt a little emotional. He thought that Minister Zhou probably had to bear a lot of pressure between the government and the back mountain. Teacher Xiaoqing is talented, courageous, and capable, so it is natural for him to be proud and cold. As a soldier of the Federation, you have to admit that he is a model soldier. No matter from which angle you look at it, it is difficult for you to find fault with him. Zhou Yingxing looked at him gently and said, "The President and the new members of the Parliament all admire him." After casually mentioning this powerful minister did not say anything else, nor did he blame Su Lu for his performance today. In the past year, Su Lu had often gone to the West Mountain compound to eat, and had also had a few deep and simple conversations with the other in the study. He had gradually gotten used to this style of speaking, but he was extremely sensitive to some hidden meaning in Minister Zhou's words. It was difficult to find fault with Du Xiaoqing. Did this mean that some people in the upper echelons of the military had been trying to find fault with the Iron 7th Division? On the surface, the data shows that only 27 MX mecha have been made, but in reality, the General Assembly Base and the Nutshell Engineering Department have already made 230 MX mecha. Minister Zhou calmly changed the topic and said, "The relevant military mechanics have also been receiving training in Hong Kong. The ones in charge of the training are Shang Qiu, whom you know, and those companions who worked with you all those years ago." Su Lu nodded. The Federation had sent Shang Qiu and the others to train mechanic engineers, while he was sent here to train pilots. With both sides working together at the same time, the actual large-scale equipment of MX should be able to be brought forward. It was just that he did not really understand why he had to train so harshly in their mecha abilities when the training officers were trained according to the standards of their commanding officers. Why did the military not let him train the original pilots of the various units? Fitting out a new mecha is a comprehensive project. It cannot be rushed. Zhou Yingxing's brows showed signs of fatigue. He said, "But no one knows how much data the Empire has on those two corridors. When will the first shot be fired in the Westwoods, so the military must hurry? The department has seen the teaching materials you wrote in the base and admired them very much, especially your statement that the pilots themselves should also be excellent mechanics. The Federation cannot immediately train tens of thousands of ready-made mechanics. If the people who operate the mecha have a deeper understanding of the mecha, this problem can be solved. After some modifications to your teaching materials, they will be sent to the 4 great military academies." Zhou Yingxing seemed to be in a better mood. He looked at him with a smile and said, "I knew you could design mecha, but I didn't expect your theoretical level of mecha operation to be so good." Su Lu was a little embarrassed. He had never formally learned how to operate mecha. He had only memorized a lot of it in Yue University. Coupled with the advanced testing system in H1, he had been able to rely on his deep knowledge of mechanics and his understanding of the MX to come up with this set of teaching materials. He had not expected that this set of teaching materials, which he had been forced to write, would actually be used by the military. In the past, the official data stated that there were only 400 M-series mecha. How many are there really? Su Lu thought back to what Minister Zhou had said earlier, and suddenly his heart skipped a beat. He had a close relationship with this important person in front of him. He could not help but want to know the big question he had when he was reading the weapons magazines in Donglin. 3,400 units. And it's still increasing at the rate of 20 units a day. Minister Zhou rested both his hands on the sofa and replied with a smile, "The MX is a brand new system. The main assembly base and nutshell don't have enough production lines, and the cost is too high. The old M-series mecha will still play a big role in future battles." Hearing this number, Su Li's heart shook. So the Federation had been hiding its true strength all this time. And looking at the trace of emotion and satisfaction on Minister Zhou's face, he remembered that this general had always been in charge of the Federation's logistics system. The astonishing number of mecha and the powerful ability to deliver supplies should be the condensation of the other's life's work and his greatest pride. Everyone knew that logistics were the key to war. And the Federation had appointed a general with a logistical background as the Federation's Minister of Defense. No matter how much of this involved, the strong recommendation of Macho Ingxing and President Pabre's balancing act, it at least proved that the Federation was changing some big concepts. Summoning him here in the middle of the night naturally couldn't be just to talk about some Federation secret numbers or daily life. Su Lu thought to himself that tonight's conversation would definitely have something to do with the MX mecha. These training officers and the Japanese military exercise this time are actually the plans drawn up by the Joint Chiefs of Staff after the MX mecha standard was officially confirmed half a year ago. Minister Zhou looked at him calmly and asked, "Do you know the true purpose of this military exercise?" Su Lu shook his head. "War is a war of people, and also a war of equipment. A revolutionary weapon will bring about a revolutionary change in the thinking of war. Unfortunately, the MX appeared too late, and the war is just around the corner. There isn't much time for the federal military generals to gradually discover the importance of the MX and gradually change the inherent tactical guiding ideology. To change the established thinking they learned from the 4 major military academies is a very difficult thing. This bend, no matter who tries, it will be very difficult to turn it around. But we need to consider what kind of situation we will face if the Empire's new mecha has already been successfully developed." Zhou Ingxing said with a serious expression, "In the future, the frontline commanders must learn a completely new commanding ideology in terms of attack and defense. Attack, they must maximize the mobility of the MX mecha. Defense, they must learn how to face the highly mobile close-range attacks of the new mecha. All the generals in the military must have a deep understanding that in the future battlefields of the planetary continent, the mecha is the most important thing." Zhou Ingxing's tone was calm, but it carried a trace of an air that brooked no resistance. This was the long-term plan of the top brass of the federal military, the crystallization of their collective wisdom, and also the general trend of the federal army's reform. "The reason why I didn't let you train the original pilots but instead train these commanders is to spread this attitude towards the MX mecha to all the troops through these officers. In the future, when this batch of officers grows up, they will become staunch supporters of the theory of mecha dominance. This is also the mission President Pabre and the military has given you." Hearing these words, Su Lu could not help but feel his mind waver. He had not expected that he would actually be involved in such an important matter. He pursed his lips and then said seriously, "The students have learned very well. In today's military exercise, the Special Mecha Battalion led by Hua Xiaoxi has already displayed the capabilities of the MX mecha. It's still too far from the requirements of the Joint Conference." Zhou Ingxing shook his head coldly and said, "Zhou, you clearly had a 70% chance of getting to the opponent's command center. They clearly knew where the MX's deep penetration ability was, but they were still limited by their inherent tactical discipline and ideology. They only dared to attack the backup mecha base of Iron 7 Division, not daring to directly attack the division headquarters. The division headquarters might have failed because they were facing the Iron 7 Division. But in this military exercise, the Joint Conference had originally hoped to display the capabilities of the MX mecha to shake the old ideology of the spectating officers. Unfortunately, the MX's capabilities were only partially displayed. The officers present and watching from afar were not truly moved. Minister Zhou rubbed his forehead tiredly and sighed softly. He said, "Without being moved from the depths of one's heart, it is very difficult to adjust the strategic thinking of an army. This is especially true for this group of academic officers, led by Commander Shaoqing. They still firmly believe that strategy is the most important thing on the battlefield. Of course, the Joint Conference will definitely not oppose this ideology, but they will need to make adjustments. In fact, one of Commander Shaoqing's personal guard camps is filled with mecha. He understands the importance of equipment better than anyone else, but he has always been proud of his daily training and commanding, so he subconsciously does not want to admit this point." Zhou Yingxing said calmly, "This is also the real reason why Admiral Miles and I came to the base. After your impromptu military exercise ends tomorrow, there will be a senior general meeting immediately. The 4 main armies and the Federal Fleet will be connected remotely." Su Lu stared blankly at the department head sitting on the sofa. Only now did he realize that the impromptu military exercise in the early hours of the morning was not because of the trivial matter between him and the Iron 7 Division. It had such a profound meaning. He suddenly felt a little cold. His voice was slightly hoarse as he said, "A super defense battalion full of mechas. I can't win. The Joint Conference is not asking you to fight the Iron 7 Division, just one camp. The military exercise plan is already out. Both sides will divide up the simulated forces and try to get as close as possible. Other than those military cadets, the 7th group will also be assigned to you." Minister Zhou waved his hand dismissively and said, "In truth, no one expects you to win. They just hope that even if you lose beautifully. You need to use ironclad facts to warn those generals that anyone who underestimates the usefulness of the MX mecha will definitely end up in a sorry state. On the battlefield, that is a tragic sight to behold." He was going to fight a battle that was destined to be unwinnable just to vent his anger and make the other side suffer heavy losses. This would leave a shadow in the hearts of the generals. Su Lu felt that this matter was a little ridiculous. Furthermore, he knew that he would lose, but he still had to lose to the bastard Iron 7 Division. Thinking of Du Shaoqing's extremely cold and murderous eyes, Su Lu felt a wave of anger rise in his heart. He said, "Can I not go? You have already signed the contract to sell your body." Zhou Yingxing looked at Su Lu, and his brows furrowed slightly. He knew in his heart that such a request was unreasonable for this person. Regardless of the outcome, if Su Lu were to beat the opponent into a pulp, he would definitely offend Du Shaoqing, who had the most limitless future in the Federation military, as well as the incomparably iron-blooded 7th Division. Thinking of this, Minister Zhou's gaze softened. Thinking of the relationship between his daughter and the man in front of him, a complicated thought suddenly appeared in his mind. Su Lu was single, and so was Yuzi. Anyway, Lu Hua's father was this fellow's name. "If, after this matter is done, come over for a meal," Minister Zhou said casually. Su Lu nodded gloomily. However, he thought that after this matter was done, the government should send Mr. Shi a special pardon, right? Thinking of this, he smiled and asked, "How's Lu Hua's appetite now?" "Very good at eating," Minister Zhou said calmly. In the warehouse on the other side of the base, the atmosphere was solemn and heavy. In the extremely spacious warehouse, 700 Federation soldiers were nervously but orderly making the final preparations before the battle. Some people cleaned up their guns, removed the real ammunition, and replaced it with digital analog signal generators. The self-propelled armored vehicles' engines began to roar. In the innermost part of the warehouse, dozens of black M52 mechas were like iron giants, coldly watching the people in the warehouse. The busy mechanical engineers beside the mechas were shouting something through the intercom, and all kinds of equipment were moving in and out. If the Iron 7th Division was the trump card of the 3rd Military Region, the trump card that the Federation regrettably didn't go through the test of war, then the local defense unit that had always followed Du Shaoqing was the trump card of the trump card. Whether it was the equipment or the quality of the soldiers, they were second to none in the entire military. They were extremely excellent, and they had always been under the command of the best military officers. Although it wasn't a real battle, the soldiers of the local defense unit were abnormally solemn. They treated any drill as a real battle, especially this impromptu drill that was about to begin in the early morning. It was related to the glory of Division Commander Shaoqing and the entire Iron 7th Division. Many people already knew about the story between the lieutenant colonel named Su Lu and their division commander on the field. After many years of peace, the Federation urgently needed a hero after the god of war retired to the lakeside of Feiqing. Du Shaoqing relied on his own talent and his achievements in the Iron 7th Division to become the successor of the god of war. He himself did not contradict this saying. His real thought was, "If not me, who else can do it?" However, the god of war suddenly left Feiqing, went to the capital special district, and went to the military prison of Qinqing, all for that kid. That kid even entered the military base, and became the instructor of this batch of officers with great potential. Du Shaoqing's cold eyes flashed with a hint of mockery. Successor? The god of war, Li Pifu, had both military wisdom and supreme bravery. He was the epitome of military talent. Du Shaoqing took away the word strategy, while Su Lu challenged Li Feng at the top of Cocky Peak and killed Macklin at S2. However, he took away the word bravery from Li Pifu. The marshal shocked the universe back then. In the end, he relied on his bravery to travel thousands of miles to kill the emperor of the empire. Du Shaoqing looked at the dark night with some loneliness and muttered to himself in his heart. Su Lu was still an inconspicuous instructor, but he already felt threatened. How far would he go in the future, a person specially trained by the army god? Therefore, he wanted to prove to the entire federal military that between strategy and bravery, strategy was the most important thing. This was also why he agreed to the Ministry of National Defense and let his subordinates and Su Lu carry out this military exercise. But in fact, in the deepest part of Du Shaoqing's heart, he had always been disgusted with the Federation and the military. He respected Li Pifu very much. When he was studying at the first military academy, he had calmly thought about this because the god of war would always die. As a person who governed the military, Du Shaoqing insisted that training the level of logistical support, the ability to implement tactics, and the unpredictability of strategic intentions were the most important things to kill the enemy on the battlefield. Individual heroism and idol creation could bring an extremely strong combat strength in normal times, but this kind of influence was too heavily relied on. Once the hero or idol died, what would the army do? However, Du Shaoqing did not notice that at this time, several soldiers left in the warehouse were secretly looking at him from afar. Looking at the tall and straight figure of their teacher, the eyes of these soldiers were filled with fanatical worship and awe. He himself was already the embodiment of the Iron 7th Division. The plan for the military exercise has been decided. The Iron 7 Division has been given a virtual high-speed missile unit by the central computer. It's a non-cruise system. Although it won't do much damage to the MX mecha, it'll still be a big problem. Our side has only been moved by a virtual reorganization camp. Those digital signals will face the trump card of Iron 7th Division, so we can't place too much hope on them. Besides, the tactical intent this time is too clear. The other side will definitely be on guard against the MX mecha breaking out of camp. If the other side has a thermal activation band monitor, then it will be very difficult for you guys to approach silently. If you guys block all electronic signals, then I can release a few inductive heat sources and try. But the problem is, if you guys block all electronic signals, then you won't be able to receive the satellite map and real-time information from the command center. In this vast mountain range, where will you find the other side's command center? The most important thing is, I might not be able to bet on the location of his command center from the electronic monitoring. Zhou Yu, who was in charge of the overall tactical deduction and specific command, was not as gentle and calm as usual. His brows were furrowed, and his expression was worried as he said, "The local defense camp's equipment is too strong. Although Du Shaoqing is not well known, I heard that he is Du Shaoqing's most trusted staff officer. He is still a guard with the rank of lieutenant colonel, and is educated by Du Shaoqing every day. You can imagine how good his commanding skills are. We will lose without a doubt. I can't think of any other way," said Zhou Yu directly. The stern-looking officer students beside him began to discuss among themselves. "Instructor Su, what do you suggest?" Hua Xiaoxi noticed the silent Su Lu and asked curiously. With these words, the room instantly fell silent. Su Lu was silent for a moment, then smiled somewhat helplessly and said, "I'm not good at this. But, Zhou Yu, can you think of a way to tear open a hole in Iron 7th Division's outer defensive perimeter and open up a path for me? Even if you can tear it open, it won't mean much. 8MX mecha are too big of a target and will be easily discovered," said Zhou Yu seriously. Su Lu lowered his head slightly, his palm lightly stroking the black workbench beside him. He said, "Hua Xiaoxi, you guys send all 7MX mecha out in a moment and leave a path for me to sneak in. No matter how strong the MX mecha are, don't expect them to actually be able to break into the opponent's command center." Zhou Yu retorted bluntly, "The internal electronic codes of the federal military are too easy to identify. As mentioned earlier, unless you turn the MX into a blind and deaf person, then there will be some possibility. But for a blind and deaf person, are you prepared to wander around the mountains for an entire day and then admit defeat? I'm going to lose anyway. Just help me leave a hole." Su Lu scratched his head, then turned his head with a wry smile to say to Xiong Linquan and the other 18 men, "You guys follow me. Once you can squeeze into the hole, then spread out and help me cover up." The entire room was silent. The officer students were all excellent all-rounders, but after thinking about it for a while, they still couldn't understand. Other than stupidity, what other adjectives could describe Instructor Xiao Su's design? The night wind blew gently. At the training base surrounded by the lush mountains, it was already autumn. Stimulated by the chill of the night, even those swaying branches seemed to be frozen stiff. 8 pure black MX mecha were like 8 proud warriors about to go on an expedition. Su Lu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the cold mecha that had been repaired and recharged. Carrying the black workbench, he climbed up in a few steps and squeezed into the comfortable design of the operation cabin. Team 7 had already taken the lead and slipped into the mountains under the night sky. These professional militants who were used to doing the dirty work for the government might not be better than the people of the Iron 7 Division in terms of military quality, but this kind of stealth work was exceptionally easy for them. Su Lu thought of the heroic figure of Xiong Linquan breaking through the forest with Carlin's guns and cannons, and couldn't help but feel a chill. The pilots of the Federation all had their own hidden treasures. This was a rule that had been cultivated over the years. The more ace the pilot was, the more bizarre and mysterious their belongings would be. Some would use their wife's sexy underwear, some would use their daughter's school bag, and some would even put a miniature statue of Li Ruofu in their mech. No one knew that Su Lu and Madman Li's hidden treasures were both boxes. It was just that Su Li's box was slightly bigger, but what he really needed was the heavy leather jacket that was hidden under the black workbench. After the phone call many days ago, the 7th young master of the Li family, who had been trying to reinvest in Su Lu, had prepared money and some controlled equipment components without hesitation. Through Zhou Yu's means, he had quietly smuggled them into the base. The equipment in the base was incomparably advanced, and Su Lu also had extremely high authority. As early as half a month ago, he had already assembled the simulation system he needed the most. With the simulation system in hand, I have the world. Without this hidden treasure, Sulu would definitely be like these military cadets when he participated in this impromptu military exercise, without any confidence. Of course, his current confidence was still not much. Accompanied by the buzzing sound of micromotors, the front hatch of the MX Mecha slowly closed. The feeling of silence and isolation once again appeared in Su Li's mind. Narrowing his eyes, he opened the central control system and performed one last round of self-check. Taking out the simulation system, he put it on and began to connect. As a mecha designer, he had an innate advantage in this aspect. The universal interface that Su Lu had designed just so happened to be able to connect to the simulation system. After 3 minutes of silence, Su Lu felt the numbing and itching sensation of electricity on the surface of his skin. He felt the scorching lines of power in his body flowing along his internal meridians, continuously sending signals to the MX Mecha. He could not help but feel a strong surge of confidence and power fill his entire body. The black MX Mecha began to move. Its cold alloy mechanical legs did not turn into forward mode, but instead trembled strangely. Then, with a strong gust of wind, the black mecha disappeared from its original position with unparalleled speed, breaking through the forest and kicking up a cloud of dust, leaves in the air, and countless birds chirping. The 7MX mecha who had been left behind seemed to freeze. In the cockpit, Hua Xiaoxi thought about the scene on the screen and could not help but rub his eyes. This level of mecha control, how high of a hand speed was needed to make a mecha display this kind of speed? Everyone was shocked and amazed. Instructor Little Su was indeed the ace pilot who had defeated the heir of the Lees of Philadelphia. This level of ferocity was truly not normal. 5:30 a.m., this strange military exercise officially began. Iron 7th Division's Ace Defense Camp, in just one encounter, displayed even greater combat power than they had displayed during the day. On the battlefield, the interference of radio waves, filtering, and strong and weak signals intertwined with each other in the air without a sound but in an incredibly tragic manner. The moment the ground troops came into contact with each other, the numerical strength of the virtual soldiers on the central computer dropped rapidly under the attack of the local defense battalion, who cut them apart like sharp blades. Zhou Yu stared at the data on the screen with a heavy expression. Only now did he know that Instructor Du Shaoqing's words were true. During the day, Iron 7th Division had indeed gone easy on them. Right now, the opponent looked like they were really going for it. His own ragtag troops could only hold on for another half an hour at most. I'm really sorry. Yesterday, I actually completely wrote the wrong chapter name, and today, I've been writing for an entire day. I've written 10,000 words, but in the end, I still couldn't finish writing this plot. I admit that I'm indeed very long-winded. Or should we call it a glorified elaboration? My eyes are already blurry, and I really can't write anymore. Friends who have finished reading this chapter seriously should be clear that there really isn't any exaggeration in it. I'm writing seriously. It's just that there seems to be too many things I want to write, and those things that need to be explained have all been gathered in this chapter by me. Chapter 338. Area 232. 938. 26 has been lost. Simulated Support Team 1 has been wiped out. Red Team's command post has retreated 3 kilometers to the right of the Yellow Mountain Ridge. In the underground military exercise command hall of the base, the staff officers of the headquarters of the 1st Military Region were walking back and forth, retrieving data for feedback. Then, they would use the work platform to perform complicated calculations, turning the real-time situation of the exercise site into a visual image and displaying it on a large holographic screen. The satellite controlled by the Federation's charter computer was faithfully superimposing these images with the real-world map, creating a world full of blood and smoke. These were all simulated data streams, but when displayed on the holographic screen, they turned into dazzling blocks of color. It was especially shocking. The staff officer who kept reporting the current situation had a dull and monotonous voice. It was like the voice of a synthetic robot. There was no change in his emotions. One reason was because staff officers needed to be calm. 2. In the eyes of everyone in the command hall, the failure of Red Team was already a fact of life. The impromptu military exercise had already been going on for 17 minutes. The Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion, which was under the command of Shimanjin, had played the role of Blue Team. From the start of the exercise, they had given everyone a huge shock. In the plan of the exercise, Blue Team, which was supposed to play the role of being attacked by the mechas, suddenly turned out in full force. Their mobile firepower fiercely attacked the valley between the two mountain ranges, catching Red Team off guard. Red Team, which was under the command of Zhou Yu and the other military cadets, suffered a huge loss at the start. Although they tried their best, and even tried their best to launch counterattacks from every small angle, they were still unable to change the situation of being gradually surrounded. The Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion perfectly executed Shimanjin's command plan. They used a seemingly simple strategy change to achieve excellent results. It had to be said that to be able to complete such a large-scale change in the darkness before dawn, this unit's training level and combat ability had reached a new level. Shimanjin is not bad. Who said that we have to stay in the barracks obediently? Although these military cadets have been to the front lines before, they have never been the commanding officer of a unit. Especially Zhou Yu, who is in charge of the specific command this time. I heard that he just graduated from No. 1 Academy? In the quiet and solemn command hall, General Myers sat on the sofa with no expression on his face. He drank a cup of hot tea and said to Minister Zhou beside him, but the Red Team reacted quickly. These officers were able to hold on for more than 10 minutes in this situation. Young people are really brave. I can see that their commanding skills are quite good. Minister of Zhouingxing nodded and looked at the holographic screen with a serious expression. The cup of tea beside him was still steaming, and he didn't even take a sip. The unit that was supposed to be on the defensive had chosen to attack in a cold and ruthless manner. This didn't violate the rules of the drill. However, the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion was able to consecutively attack 3 key areas of the military cadets' side in an extremely short period of time. This wasn't entirely due to the lack of preparation on the part of the military cadet. It was because this unit had truly achieved the combat style of a mountain collapsing when they move. Commander Shimanjin's orders were clear, concise, and powerful. His troops were also very used to this kind of fighting style. Their ability to make use of the terrain and surpass the terrain was indescribably powerful. They had truly pushed the mobility of a fully automated mechanic to the extreme. In front of such an iron-blooded army, the data simulated by the Federation's central computer was obviously nothing. The Joint Chiefs of Staff was most concerned about the performance of the MX mecha. However, in the face of the sharp attacks of the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion, their hands and feet were completely tied. Minister Zhou looked at the light screen indifferently, and a faint sense of shock arose in his heart. Who would have thought that the commander named Shimanjin would actually place the thermal activation band monitoring equipment at the forefront of the battlefield, and not at the most crucial command center? Moreover, this person had actually turned the armored vehicles, which were originally loaded with electromagnetic beam bombs, into countless explosive packs that would explode with a single trigger. They then charged toward the military officers' front line. Currently, the most effective weapon against mecha was the electromagnetic beam bomb. Perhaps the MX mecha's mobility was enough to mitigate most of the damage, but even an ace pilot would feel fear when he saw that the area he had to pass through was filled with these things. At the 212, 453 front line, if the Iron 7th Division's determination to advance had been delayed by even a second, the MX mecha on the military cadets' side would have been able to pass through this checkpoint. However, at this time, This checkpoint was blocked by the Iron 7th Division without any fear of death. The battle situation on the holographic screen was very tragic. Although the Red Team under the command of Officer Sheng was already showing signs of defeat, those troops were still valiantly defending every line under their command. It was indeed a siege, because although their command center had tactically retreated 3 kilometers, according to the way both sides were fighting without regard for their lives, in the end, it would only lead to them being trapped and then completely annihilated. Zhou Yu and the military cadets' command was not too big of a problem, but after all, they were commanding a virtual army. On the other hand, the defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division was made up of real people. Only soldiers had the soul of a soldier, and could unleash power greater than what was calculated by the computer. In the face of such a force, even the most desperate resistance seemed to be futile. Minister Zhou rubbed his forehead tiredly. He had not slept for a night, so he was a little tired. However, this tiredness came from the drill site. If the command center and electronic command network were destroyed, even if the 8MX mecha could escape the threat of the Iron 7th Division's electromagnetic beam bombs, how would they be able to find the enemy's command center? How would they be of any use? It seemed that the far-reaching intentions of the federal military still could not be realized. He took a sip of the thick tea and frowned. He thought to himself that choosing the Iron 7th Division as the side for the drill was probably the wrong choice. However, if the MX had not shocked the hearts of the Federation's ace troops during the drill, how would those stubborn generals be willing to change their command strategy? In comparison, Shimin Jin's tactical command strategy was more suitable for the MX mecha. If the 8MX mecha had been on the defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division, the battle would have probably ended long ago. With this thought, Minister Zhou put down his teacup and subconsciously glanced to his right. On the sofa on the far right of the first row of the drill command hall, the commander of the Iron 7th Division, Du Shaoqing, still had a cold expression on his face. Just like during the day, he did not seem to care about the development of the drill. His head was lowered and he was resting, but his sunglasses were missing. Commander Du Shaoqing kept everyone at arm's length and was confident that he did not care about the progress of the drill. However, there were many senior military officers in the command hall who were concerned about this tragic and somewhat helpless drill. They were impressed by the commanding ability of the cadets, but what shocked them even more was the battle prowess of the Iron 7th Division and the extremely calm command of the commander. Nonsense! General Miles roared with a gloomy expression. This chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was the same as Minister Zhou. What he was most concerned about was the performance of the MX mecha in the drill. Right then, he saw the screen displaying that the Red Team had scattered all 8 MX mecha, as if trying to break them up into smaller groups and forcefully cross the 453 line. He could no longer control his emotions and slammed his hand down on the coffee table, causing the tea in his cup to spill out. The orderlies hurried over to clean up. General Miles took off the button on his collar and pointed at the screen. He loudly reprimanded, "The electromagnetic beam is a damn thing, but how can we have time to dodge it? By the time the mechas get away, our base camp will be completely wiped out." The federal military had already come to a certain conclusion after numerous experiments on the MX mecha. This revolutionary new mecha, once fully displayed its mobility, was incomparably powerful. However, under Shimin Jin's precise command, the defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division had already lured the 8MX mecha into the most unfavorable terrain. Still trying to fish in troubled waters at this time? They will only be destroyed by the division. General Miles reprimanded darkly. Once they are captured by electronic surveillance, they will be trapped in the terrain and have to face continuous attack. How can they survive? If they were to support each other, these 8MX mecha would at least contain all of the M-series mecha and half of the self-propelled artillery systems of the Iron 7th Division. He took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the anger in his heart. He said coldly, "I saw that Zhou Yu's command was not bad at all. How could he have made such a stupid mistake?" Minister Zhou smiled slightly and said, "I'm afraid it was Su Li's idea." Admiral Miles was stunned. A faint bitter smile flashed across his slightly red wrinkles due to excitement. The development of the drill was just as the general had predicted. In order to cover the 8 MX Mecha's dispersal, the Military Officers Command Center launched the last virtual airdrop. However, they had no choice but to choose the airdrop location to be in a valley. In the end, they were completely surrounded. On the other hand, Shimin Jin, who was commanding the Iron 7 Division's guards, coldly maintained their military positions in all directions. They carefully deployed their forces, neither too fast nor too slow. However, they stared fiercely at the 7 MX mechas. A few sure-kill encirclements gradually formed near the light spots that represented the MX mechas. They were filled with killing intent. Once the encirclement formed by the self-propelled artillery and the mecha was completed, no matter how strong the MX mecha were, they would not be able to last for long in this kind of rugged, hilly terrain in the middle of the night without any firepower support. The people in the Military Exercise Command Center looked at the screen with a sorrowful and emotional gaze. The MX mecha relied on their mobility to force their way out of the encirclement. However, not long after, they were forcefully surrounded by the indifferent soldiers of the Iron 7th Division. They were surrounded again and divided into a few lonely circles. The clear tactic of the Iron 7th Division was gradually showing its power. However, strangely, Shimin Jin did not use the unmanned cruise missile position that the central mainframe had deployed. Was it because he did not want to use it, or was there another reason? The people in the Military Exercise Command Center were guessing Shimin Jin's intentions. They were calculating the time when the red team would fail. At this time, Du Shaoqing finally stopped resting. He slowly raised his head and looked at the progress on the screen. His indifferent face was still expressionless. The hand holding the lambskin glove gradually relaxed. Number 1 MX main cannon has failed. Damage integration is at 17%. Number 3 MX component has been destroyed. Number 7 MX has entered electronic shielding mode. Other than the normal data of the damaged system, all communications are cut off. Unable to locate. The red team has released an electronic interference method. The band level is Gamma Level 3. According to calculations, within 2 hours, all the red team's electronic interference equipment will not be able to be activated again due to overload. The calm voice of the staff officer finally caused a small fluctuation in the Military Exercise Command Center. Everyone noticed that a MX mecha on the screen had suddenly disappeared. The red team has used all their electronic interference. What are they betting on? General Miles frowned slightly and whispered to himself, "The MX is in a self-shielding state. It is not easy for the Iron 7th Division to discover it. However, the pilot can no longer receive any signals. Doesn't that mean he has become blind and mute?" He shook his head and said, "Is this MX trying to learn from a blind cat that has found a dead mouse? Is he trying to break into the blue team's command center by wandering around in the mountains?" After saying this, General Miles and the other generals around him couldn't help but laugh out loud, and the atmosphere in the field eased a little. "Bring up the real-time satellite image." General Miles frowned and said, "I want to see what this pilot is planning to do. Is he planning to find a big cave and hide there until the end of the exercise?" Half a minute later, a staff officer reported with an unpleasant expression, "Commander, there is a delay in the satellite image. The mecha's movement after blocking the signal was too fast. We are unable to locate it for the time being." Hearing this, the generals sitting in the first row of the Military Exercise Command Center were suddenly interested. They all thought of a person's name. Probably only that person could operate a mecha that could reach such a speed. Du Shaoqing, who was sitting on the sofa on the far right, was expressionless. A hint of interest flashed through his eyes. He thought to himself, what else can Su-Lu do in this situation? Su-Lu was not doing anything. Right now, he was panting heavily in the dimly lit cockpit. He was anxiously observing his surroundings through the infrared search equipment and visual ray capture system. He did not even have time to wipe away the sweat that was dripping down his forehead. From the start, they had never thought that they would be able to defeat Iron 7 Division's trump card in a direct confrontation. Everything was only because of Zhou Yu and the other officers' trust in him. The Red Team had sacrificed a lot. Even 7MX Mecha had fallen into the merciless encirclement of Iron 7 Division. Only then had they found an opportunity for Su-Lu to hide. The mountains were in the darkest moment before dawn. In the distance there were faint flashes of white light. Although the sound of explosions could not be heard, the feeling of being filled with blood and fire constantly drifted in the valley. He knew that Zhou Yu and the other officers in the command center were not having a good time. All of their manpower had been invested in the battle on the west side of the Yellow Mountain Ridge. In fact, because most of the command center was virtual combat power, most of the officers were even willing to use themselves as staff officers. It was also because of the stubborn resistance of these officers, the cover of the 7MX Mecha, and even the 18 men of Iron 7 Division, that Su-Lu was able to find an opening on the battlefield and sneak in. The Red Team's last and most intense electronic interference attack was to cover for his breakthrough. Su-Lu brought up the electronic map on the screen and looked at it carefully. Unfortunately, even at the last moment before they blocked themselves and cut off all electronic communication, the officers still could not find the location of Iron 7 Division's command center. Shimanjin was very similar to Du Shaoqing. He did not reveal any loopholes at all. Thinking of these two names, Su-Lu felt a chill in his heart. A shadow flashed across his eyes. He knew that Iron 7 Division was an invincible division in the Federation's military exercises. However, only when he was on the battlefield and saw with his own eyes this meticulous, calm, and machine-like, ferocious, beast-like force, could he truly understand how terrifying they were. This battle was too tragic. The Iron 7 Division was indeed ferocious. Even though there was only one battalion participating today, they still fought with the resentment and murderous spirit they had accumulated over the years. Their sharpness was unstoppable and indescribably cold. The tiger in the West Woods had suppressed Du Shaoqing for 10 years, but Du Shaoqing had successfully transformed this emotion into the temperament or soul of an army. Once it was displayed on the battlefield, it was truly terrifying. Moreover, the commander named Shimanjin was indeed very outstanding. The 18 men of Iron 7 Division who had protected him when they entered the mountain area were indeed able to erupt with power that even Su-Lu praised. However, even though they had killed more than 40 enemies, they were all killed in the end. In front of the ruthless Iron 7 Division, the strength of this small group was mercilessly crushed into powder. Not even a speck of dust was left behind. At this moment, Su-Lu had to admit that Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division had the right to be proud. His bodyguard, Du Shaoqing, was already so fierce. What if Du Shaoqing was personally in command? After a few deep breaths, he calmed down. After confirming that the electronic shielding system was working properly, he quickly keyed in commands with the fingers of his right hand. His left hand gently pushed the control stick, and the black MX mecha glided to the right in the dense forest. The heavy body of the mecha did not make any noise that would have woken Squirrel. It looked more like a ghost. Under the self-shielding system, the MX mecha did not emit any signals other than the visible and infrared devices. It was also unable to receive any signals. The small semi-aperture radar and SSC search system were also forced to shut down. Right now, the mecha he was operating was like a moving rock. It could not see into the distance, nor could it hear any good news carried by the wind. The cadets did not buy much time for him. Once the command center and the 7MX mechas were destroyed, the Iron 7 Division's defense battalion would retreat. He would not have any more chances. In this tense moment where every second counted, Su Lu did not move. Instead, he closed his eyes. A rock would not always be upright. There were times when it was crazy and there were times when it was shameless. Su Lu thought of the chilling aura emanating from Du Shaoqing's body. He thought of what he had seen with his own eyes. He thought of his comrades being utterly defeated by the Iron 7 Division. His hair stood on end. Not only did he have to complete the difficult mission given to him by the military, but also because of the murderous intent that Du Shaoqing had revealed. In the future, if he had to constantly worry about a famous general behind him trying to eliminate him on the battlefield in the West Woods, it would not be a good life. Therefore, Su Lu decided to win this exercise at all costs. He had to suppress the arrogance of the Iron 7 Division. So, he decided to cheat. He closed his eyes and stared into the deep darkness. He listened to the smooth and low sounds coming from the cockpit. He said in his heart, "Old thing, I need you to show me the way." There was no response. His mind was blank. There was no white light. There was nothing. This blank state did not last long, but to Su Lu, it felt as long as a century. The glory of the Charter was his biggest support in the Federation. It was his biggest secret. Even Uncle Lu would not have guessed such a bizarre thing. However, this was also his biggest fear. He did not understand why the old thing would help him. He also did not know when the old thing would abandon him or even arrest him. 7 seconds. Cold sweat dampened the simulation system on his skin. Su Lu finally heard a voice that was usually abnormally old-fashioned. Today, however, it was exceptionally pleasant to the ear. What is it this time? Chapter 339. Hearing this sentence, all the pores on Su Li's skin opened at the same time. The cold sweat on his skin seemed to turn into mist and dissipated in an instant, leaving behind only a sense of comfort. The reason why he had such a strong feeling was because the previous 7 seconds of silence made him very frightened. The far-flung the glory of the Charter relied on countless aircraft, satellites, ground electronic monitoring networks, and even all the chips used by the government to build a giant network that would never have any gaps or gap. In the past, when Su Lu wanted to actively contact the great existence through this network, there was never any delay. The other party was like a god that would answer all his requests, always by his side. He needed to delay for a period of time before he could contact the other party. This was something he had never experienced before. It was just that in the tragic and tense military exercise site, Su Lu didn't have enough energy to capture this strange phenomenon and arouse enough vigilance. He just subconsciously felt that the first sentence that the old thing said today was a little different. "Help me find a person, Iron 7th Division Lieutenant Colonel Shimin Jin." Looking at the grid in his left eye, Su Lu quickly said. The Federal Central Computer wouldn't always appear in his retina with the face of an old butler. Sometimes it was just some relatively simple and boring lines. He didn't know what kind of algorithm the Federal Central Computer represented. In the Fox Fortress Black Dungeon, Su Lu had a lot of conversations with the computer of the Bureau of Proclamation. He was already familiar with and used to this mode of communication in his mind, so even though he knew that the other party was operating a cold and mechanical program, he always felt like he was talking to an old butler. This goes against the Charter. Without hearing the complete sentence, Su Lu said in his mind, "It's not like you haven't done it before. Although until today, I still don't understand what kind of virus is in your computer to make it go crazy. You know what I'm doing right now." Su Lu quickly said to the grid of light dots in his mind, "Just treat it as a game. After all, it's not like the last time in the building where I need you to help me kill someone." The old man was silent for a long time. Suddenly, there was a change in his voice as he said, "Since it's a game, why don't I just change the data and kill all of the enemy's simulated troops? Then, I'll send you 2 armies? In the cockpit, Su-Lu was startled. He lifted the light screen goggles on his eyes. Only then did he remember that a large portion of the simulated firepower in today's military exercise was simulated and distributed by the charter computer. Hearing the old man's suggestion, he couldn't help but be a little dumbfounded. He said, "Even if you want to cheat, you should have some professional ethics. You have to leave a way out for others." Because of this shock, he once again missed the opportunity to notice the old thing's abnormality today. It was obvious that the computer program in the depths of the Bureau of Proclamation was very mischievous today. Su-Li's left eye could see ghosts and people that he couldn't see before. It was like an omniscient and omnipotent radar. However, beyond his own body and even the mecha outside of his body, through the chip behind his neck, he was connected to the charter of the universe. This was his biggest secret. In the darkness before dawn, when the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion was about to win the military exercise, he decided to use this ability that made him feel a little scared and wanted to avoid it. The other end of the black dream fell silent again. The fine light dots condensed into a grid and simulated a 3-dimensional map. It was transmitted into his brain and appeared on his retina. If he wanted to, and the old man agreed, he could even peek at the First Lady taking a bath. At this time, it wasn't very difficult to find the calm Lieutenant Colonel Shimin-Jin in the middle of the mountains. If he found Shimin-Jin, he would find the headquarters of the Iron 7th Division. Turning off all of the mecha's detection equipment, Su-Lu stared at the holographic screen in front of him with his naked eyes. He controlled the black MX mecha and moved silently through the forest. Following the map points in his eyes, he gradually approached his target. His eyes grew brighter and brighter, like a wolf shooting out the light of its prey in the dark forest. After the MX mecha's automatic electronic shielding, it became a rock in the dark night. Regardless of whether it was the heat it emitted or the electromagnetic wave that leaked out from the dual engines, it was all carefully designed and controlled within an extremely small range. The problem was that the MX in this state had a huge disadvantage. It had lost all of its detection equipment. It could only hide but not launch a surprise attack. However, Su-Lu, who was controlling the MX, was able to make up for this disadvantage. At 6:13 a.m., a faint ray of light appeared on the horizon, but the surroundings were still pitch black. There were no sounds of birds or insects in the forest, only bursts of light coming from the direction of the Yellow Mountains in the distance. It looked like the troops commanded by Zhou Yu and those military cadets were still making their last stand. After capturing the location of the Iron 7th Division's headquarters, Su-Lu used more than 10 minutes to control the Black MX. Like a ghost, under the cover of the night, he used his superb control skills to silently climb over 2 steep mountain peaks and approach the enemy's camp. Along the way, although the heavy mecha couldn't avoid crushing a few rocks and making some noise, startling the 2 sleeping eagles, the mecha still managed to successfully hide from the Iron 7th Division's strict electronic surveillance equipment under its automatic electronic shielding state. The Black MX mecha arrived at the peak of Blue Lake. In front of it was a steep slope, and below it was the command camp of the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion. Looking from afar in the darkness, there were only a few dim lights in the camp, so it was impossible to see how much firepower was hidden. In the mecha, Su-Lu frowned as he carefully analyzed the terrain and the enemy's defenses. He knew that stealth would stop here. If the 2 sides got any closer, they would no longer be within the range of the electronic shielding battle. The Black MX mecha's body would be visible to the naked eye. That old thing's earlier words could only be taken as a joke. If the central computer really did suddenly kill all of Blue Team's virtual troops and then transferred 2 divisions worth of troops to Red Team, how could the military exercise continue? Finding the enemy's headquarters was already cheating, but to actually break through the enemy's headquarters and obtain victory in this military exercise, Su-Lu had to do it himself. Still haven't found it? In the military exercise command hall, General Miles had a dark expression on his face as he unceremoniously reprimanded the staff officers around him. That MX Mecha had already disappeared for a long time. The intense battle at the front line of the Lonely Ridge at Yellow Mountain Ridge had already reached its end, but in the end, the command hall still had not been able to pull up the image of that MX Mecha. This sort of information-gathering ability naturally did not satisfy him. Found it. A military staff officer suddenly stood up from behind the workbench and said excitedly, "We found it just now, but there was a delay in the data. The satellite image was only pulled up now." "Then hurry up and show it," General Miles said in a low voice. There were 30 or so large screens in the command hall, and 7 of them showed a circular moving image. In the extremely dark background of the image, only the faint silhouette of a black mecha could be seen. It was running non-stop in the mountains behind the base, leaping and running at an extremely fast speed. "Is that Sulu?" General Miles frowned as he turned to ask Minister Zhou. Zhou brow was also furrowed and he said, "Should be." "Where is he going?" "He hasn't slowed down at all." General Miles couldn't quite guess the intentions of that black mecha. Could it be that he knows where 7th Division's headquarters is? Zhou Yingxing shook his head. "It's clearly in a completely shielded state. Both sides' public satellite signals can't be received, so how can he find it?" Just as the two military bigwigs were whispering to each other, the military exercise command hall gradually quieted down. All of the high-ranking generals and staff officers in charge of the exercise planning had their eyes firmly glued to the silhouette of the MX Mecha on the screen. The image taken by the military's precision satellite was very clear, and due to the angle of the lighting, the black mecha that had been running along the mountain ridge was faintly shrouded in a layer of faint light. Facing the rugged, weathered rock face of the mountain, this black mecha was actually running so fast. Whether it was leaping or zigzagging, it had no intention of slowing down. Moreover, looking at the analysis of the dust when the mecha's feet landed on the ground, it was likely that even the sound of the landing would not be too loud. Could this be the true form of the MX Mecha? But no matter how advanced the MX Mecha was, to be able to run along the mountains at such a high speed and with such stability and serenity, it could only rely on the pilot's superb control skills. In the hands of this pilot, the black mecha's movements were clear and concise, light and agile, exuding an indescribable sense of wonder and beauty. It far surpassed the impression that the average military ace pilot left on others. Who was this pilot? The military exercise command hall was silent. Everyone's eyes were glued to the screen, to the black mecha on the screen walking silently on the other side of the mountain ridge. Du Shaoqing had been sitting quietly on the sofa on the far right. Even when the entire hall was in awe of the black MX mecha's silence, he was still unusually calm and cool, not a ripple in his heart. When General Miles and Minister Zhou had thought of the identity of that pilot, he had already determined that the person in the black mecha could only be Su Lu, for someone who could be chosen by the Federation's military god. If he could not display an extraordinary level of strength, then he would actually be a little disappointed. His right hand held the black lambskin glove lightly as he looked coldly at the black mecha on the screen. It was advancing like a leopard cat, as if it had completely escaped the shackles of gravity. A hint of interest flashed through his deep eyes. Running like this, could it be that he would be able to find his troops in the mountains? Although the specific commander of this impromptu military exercise was Shimanjin, Du Shaoqing still only thought that this was his troops, and they could not be defeated. On the wide screen, only a black MX mecha could be seen moving forward at full speed, running, jumping, and moving freely and silently among the mountains. The image was a little dull, but what was strange was that even if the two military bigwigs were not watching the black mecha's figure seriously, no one would have thought of switching the screen. For everyone in the hall, this black mecha that had disappeared alone should be the winner of this military exercise. All the soldiers in the command hall who were watching the battle were inexplicably nervous and confused. The black mecha seemed to be running like a headless fly. Did it hide a hidden meaning that no one could guess? This mystery was revealed when the black mecha stopped for the first time, and also when it stopped for the last time. The black mecha felt its way to the top of a mountain and then quietly squatted down, as if preparing for something. There was a camp below the valley. "What is this place?" Minister Zhou asked curiously. Although the military exercise command hall was very clear about the military deployment and losses of both sides, right now, everyone's eyes had followed the black mecha for so long that they were a little confused. Blue Pool Mountain. Peak number 2. It was still that military staff officer who was in charge of information gathering. He stood up from behind the workbench and said in a trembling voice, full of disbelief, Zhou Yingxing frowned and turned to look at him. That military staff officer licked his dry lips and said in a slightly hoarse voice, "In the valley is the blue team's command center." The black mecha had run all the way through the mountains without slowing down, and in the end, it had actually bumped into the blue team's command center? At this time, of course, no one believed that this pilot had been a blind cat that had hit the mouse, a headless fly that had headed straight for the washroom, completely relying on luck. Everyone was shocked. A mecha that could not receive any signals on its own, how could it have found the blue team's command center? General Miles grunted in surprise and sat back down on the sofa. His white eyebrows raised slightly, and he seemed very satisfied. Minister Zhou's face was still calm, but he picked up the cup of tea on the coffee table and slowly took a few sips. The command hall could no longer keep quiet. Everyone began to talk in private, and the buzzing sound was accompanied by feelings of shock, filling the entire underground space. Du Shaoqing looked at the screen in shock. Even he did not know where Shimin would put the command center, so he had been calm before, but who would have thought that that guy would actually find it? His expression was cold, and 2 dark clouds appeared in his eyes. A major of the Iron 7th Division walked to his side and whispered a few words in his ear, then respectfully handed over the sunglasses. Du Shaoqing took the sunglasses, but did not put them on. Instead, he coldly placed them on the coffee table beside him. The major hesitated. He wanted to say a few words of advice, but looking at the commander's already cold face, in the end, he did not dare to say anything. Finding the command center does not mean you have the ability to break through the camp. Even I admire Shimin Jin's ability to set up camp. You only have 1 MX. I want to see how you can break through the camp and win. Du Shaoqing looked at the black mecha resting on the peak of the mountain on the screen, and a fierce light flashed through his deep eyes. Right at this time, a soft cry came from the command hall. It was not that the black mecha had done something amazing again, but that the first ray of sunlight from planet S1 had finally broken through the horizon and spilled onto the ground. The black MX mecha that was quietly squatting on the peak of the Blue Lake Mountain just happened to welcome the freshest sunlight. In the dim light of dawn, the black mecha bathed to its heart's content, full of solemn beauty. This scene was truly beautiful. After Du Shaoqing graduated with the highest score from the 1st Military Academy, he was assigned to the 3rd Military Region. Ignoring the military headquarters' request to cherish talent, he forcefully requested to enter the already fallen Iron 7th Division. In the Iron 7th Division, his first position was as the battalion commander of the Independent Battalion. The resurgence of the Iron 7th Division was also due to the victory of the Independent Battalion in a certain military exercise. Du Shaoqing had been promoted from battalion commander to division commander. The 1st Independent Battalion he led was also reorganized into the local defense battalion that protected the division headquarters. What the black mecha Su Lu was facing was precisely this kind of super-mechanized battalion that had a glorious tradition and powerful combat strength. In the impromptu military exercise this morning, despite the efforts of Zhou Yu and the other officers, The 7th team had still been torn apart by the local defense camp. Sulu, on the other hand, only had one MX mecha. Yet, he had to face the seemingly calm but definitely heavily guarded headquarters of the local defense camp. The morning light shone on the mountain peak, shining on the black mecha that was half crouched like a statue. Iron 7th Division headquarters definitely didn't expect a mecha to be able to reach their headquarters in a completely shielded state, but their commander was Shimanjin. Just as Division Commander Du Shaoqing had praised, Shimanjin was a very strict person. Even in this kind of highly modern simulation exercise, he still arranged for human sentries around the camp. The first person to discover the black MX mecha was a soldier on the western sentry post. Without any warning, a sharp alarm rang through the quiet valley. The small radius precision radar began to scan wildly, trying to determine the location of the enemy. Early in the morning was the best time to launch a sneak attack, but it definitely wasn't suitable for Iron 7th Division. The exercise had only started in the early morning, so all the officers and soldiers of this division still maintained a very clear mind and spirit. From the moment they had discovered the black MX mecha, it had only taken 3 seconds for the self-propelled cannons around the camp to aim at the peak of Blue Pond Peak under the guidance of the electronic system. With a violent roar, the cannons fired without hesitation. In an instant, the roar was so loud that the entire valley seemed to shake. Who knew how many self-firing cannons Shimanjin had set up around the camp headquarters? These self-firing cannons were simple to equip and easy to set up. They didn't have much destructive power in the mountains, but once they were used to fire at fast targets on the slopes, they were extremely powerful. Could it be that Iron 7th Division had thought from the start that the mecha could break through the camp? Or could it be that this was an ambush? Sulu didn't think too much about it. From the moment he had appeared on the peak, he had entered battle mode. It was only natural that he would be discovered by the enemy, so he didn't panic. As for what kind of defensive measures Iron 7th Division had set up around the camp headquarters, it was none of his business. He was a simple and direct person. With an axe, he would smash a future, and with a knife, he would cleave a ray of light. Right now, with the MX mecha in hand, the strength in his body was surging. Other than rushing down, he had not prepared a second battle plan for himself at all. It was precisely because of this kind of absolute heroism that the black mecha rushed down the steep slope from the peak. Even if it wasn't a sneak attack, it was still a sneak attack. 3 seconds later, the self-firing cannons were all aimed at the top of the black mecha. From this, one could see how fast the mecha was. Sitting in the cockpit, Sulu stared at the holographic screen in front of him. His left eye was looking at the eye-catching row of citizen numbers in the valley camp. He felt the intense vibrations coming from the mecha, but his heart was unprecedentedly calm. Every time he entered the mecha, he would enter a very strange mental state. It was as if the mecha was the real world, while the outside world was completely isolated. There were only countless data models moving quickly there. His left hand pushed the control stick fiercely, his right hand quickly entering command. The simulation system was at full power, the precision instruments magnifying and correcting every tiny movement of his body, then faithfully reproduced by the black MX mecha. Silently and sternly, the mecha charged down the mountain peak. The black mecha rushed down the steep slope from the peak. There was no longer any sense of lightness, only an unstoppable momentum. With every step the heavy alloy mecha took, a few pieces of rock burst out. It was as if the entire mountain peak was trembling. The huge recoil force was absorbed by the mecha's highly efficient connecting devices and spherical joints, turning into a forward momentum. Thus, with every step the black mecha took, its speed increased by a few notches. Under the mecha's feet, the mountain rocks cracked, like a yellow dragon in the morning light. At the end of the yellow dragon, the black MX mecha's body was unusually cold. Its speed increased, to the point where the mecha's movement frequency could not be seen clearly. "What is he trying to do?" asked General Miles, frowning in the command hall. "Speed up?" said Zhou uncertainly, his brow also tightly furrowed. "He's going to fall to his death if he speeds up any more," said General Miles silently. With the current slope of Blue Pool Mountain, if the Black Mecha continued to speed up like this, there was no need for Iron 7th Division's concentrated artillery fire at all. He would fall to his death. However, he believed that the young man his old teacher had chosen would give him another surprise like before, so he did not say this out loud. Jin did not think that the Black Mecha charging down from the monitor would fall to his death, because even after being attacked, he still maintained the absolute calm of a commander. The other party had gone through untold hardships to find their way to his camp, definitely not to commit suicide, so he decided to send the other party on his way. Today's military exercise, the battle in the Lonely Mountains and Yellow Mountain Ridge, had been decided. Although the resistance of the officers and cadets was unexpectedly fierce, making it difficult for him to deal with, in the end they had won. As long as they destroyed this Black Mecha, which could be either amazing or stupid, the Iron 7th Division would welcome another victory. "Fire from all directions," Jin calmly gave the order. He picked up his cup of coffee and took a sip, allowing the staff officer beside him to operate the electronic workstation. He had carefully studied all of the technical parameters of the MX Mecha, so he was very clear about the terrifying movement speed and close-range combat ability of this new mecha. Thus, he was very certain that under his long-prepared all-around attack this time, that Black Mecha would definitely be hit continuously. The first round of concentrated fire from the howitzers did not even graze the side of the Black Mecha. It was as comical as setting off a round of fireworks to cheer on the Black Mecha's heroic attack. But inside the mecha, Su Lu was abnormally calm. The Iron 7th Division, who had won 37 consecutive military exercises, would not be flustered by his sneak attack, even though the person personally in command this time was not that cold and ruthless division commander due as expected. The reactivated MX's onboard radar and SCC search system suddenly emitted a shrill warning. Trembling violently, Su Lu stared at the screen and narrowed his eyes. Looking at the complex lines on the screen that represented lethality, Su Lu really could not understand. Could it be that Jin had guessed that he would charge down from this hillside? Otherwise, how could the opponent's battalion headquarters have perfectly repositioned all the howitzers in such a short amount of time? Or could it be that the Iron 7th Division's usual training was already at such a terrifying level? Hundreds of howitzers were already roaring towards him. Su Lu did not have much time to think. On this kind of slope, the Iron 7th Division's firepower area was precisely controlled to an oval area in front of and behind him. It was truly terrifying. The MX Mecha could withstand the howitzers head-on, but it could not withstand too many of them. Moreover, if the battle damage system determined that the damage was too severe, it could be immediately disqualified. Right then, the only thing Su Li's Black Mecha needed to do was to dodge these densely packed horizontal grenades. However, this also seemed to be something that was completely impossible to do. No matter how great the mobility of the MX Mecha was, under such a complex barrage of firepower, even the strongest Federation pilot would find it difficult to make precise dodging. The military exercise command hall was silent. Many of the officers looked at the screen with mixed feelings. On the screen, the 200-meter radius of the slope at the foot of Blue Cake Mountain had already been plowed by the howitzers. Although they did not carry actual ammunition, those high-speed ejections had still blasted countless bits of the hard mountain rock into pieces, sending dust and smoke into the air. The high-ranking officers who were watching this military exercise were still in awe of the Black Mecha's elusive methods and heroic charge. Now, seeing Iron 7th Division's steel-like calmness and computer-like precision of calculation, they could not help but feel a chill in their hearts. In the shortest amount of time, they had made the most appropriate response. When the enemy seemed to be at their strongest, they had used the simplest of volleys to strangle this heroic attack in its cradle. "Report the damage of that mecha," General Miles said urgently. The officers in the hall were somewhat surprised. Under such concentrated firepower, did the commander still think that the mecha would be able to retain a certain amount of combat power? It should be known that this volley of howitzers by the local defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division looked simple, but in reality, the timing and area of effect had been perfect. After hearing General Miles's words, the staff officer was stunned for a moment, then hurriedly pulled up the data. When everyone in the hall saw the damage figures of the mecha, they could not help but think that the staff officer had been too flustered and gotten the numbers wrong. Not even 2% of the battle losses were achieved? General Miles's expression gradually became strange as he stared at the image magnified by the staff officer on the screen. On the screen, the black mecha was in the midst of the smoke and dust. Amidst the hail of bullets, its entire body trembled. Countless high-speed howitzers brushed past it, making it difficult for the enemy to reach it. In an extremely dangerous situation, the black mecha could be hit at any time, but it relied on its incredible maneuvering to twist the body of the mecha, jumping around like a ray of black light. It was like an old willow tree that was gradually darkening in color, no matter how the wind and rain hit it, but it was always strong enough to survive. General Miles stood up abruptly. With an extremely complicated expression, he looked at the trembling figure of the black mecha on the screen with passion and sadness. He couldn't help but think of the past, of that old man who had brought him through life and death. Chapter 340. Not the past, not the old teacher. General Miles stood up abruptly and looked at the black mech on the screen with great emotion. After a while, he came back to his senses. Many years had passed since those days of war on the Empire's planet field. The black mech trembled under the bombardment of grenades on the steep slopes of the Blue Pool Peak. It used its demonic high-speed body movements to avoid damage and continued to accelerate forward with a chill. Compared to the old teacher with the surnamely, it was obvious that there was still a huge gap. He operated an MX, while the old teacher operated an M37. However, he still had not reached the level of the old teacher where he could break through obstacles alone and make the rivers give way to him. However, the two mechs that were separated by decades, whether it was the control method or the traces of movement, there were some similarities. General Miles looked at this scene and thought that he understood the real reason why the old teacher protected Sulu so much. He couldn't help but be speechless. In reality, it only took a very short time to dodge through 17 complicated and difficult areas at high speed. The people watching the military exercise only felt that their eyes were blurred for a few seconds. The black mech instantly escaped the range of the grenades and broke through the smoke and dust in the valley. Like a god of death from the netherworld, it continued to rush down the mountain. Whether it was the initial sniper attack or the difficult process of avoiding the grenade firing line after that, the black mech did not slow down at all. Even every indeterminate turn and slide was completed at high speed. Seeing the speed at which the black mecha was falling towards the valley was getting faster and faster, about to become a stream of flowing black light, the spectators, who had already been shocked by the pilot's superb control skills, could not help but feel a chill run down their spines. If the speed limit was exceeded and the onboard system lost control, would this black mecha fall to pieces? They should have guessed that this pilot would be like before and would definitely be hiding many surprises. However, seeing this kind of high-speed crazy impact that was close to losing control with their own eyes, the people were still very worried. Being hit head-on by the crazy black MX mech, the headquarters of the Iron 7th Division in the valley was still calm. The invisible electric waves in the air flowed quickly. All the soldiers coldly and calmly continued with the work at hand, as if they did not see this scene. Along with the clear sound of motors, the level-firing grenade base completed its second round of automatic aiming in the shortest amount of time. Following the officer's order, the electrically controlled anti-infantry mines buried in front of the steep slope of Blue Pool Mountain exploded one after another, sending countless earth pillars into the air. Like countless fireworks, they blocked the path of the Black Mecha. This type of weapon, which was extremely destructive against individual soldiers and even armored vehicles, might not be able to do much damage to the sturdy MX Mecha, but it could successfully interfere with the field's vision, buying the best opportunity and space for the level-firing grenade launchers. The sky full of grenades rained down again. At this time, the Black Mecha had already charged up 3/5 of the steep slope. Its own speed had already been raised to a terrifying level. Under such high inertia, no matter how skilled the pilot was, he would not be able to make those inconceivable dodging movements in the face of this sky full of grenades. The fire control of the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion was so precise that it was praiseworthy. They didn't panic because of the enemy's strength, and didn't hesitate because of the failure of the first wave of attack. They quickly launched the second wave of attacks without pause, and the details were calculated very precisely. At this moment, even if the uncle was reborn, or the old man came out of seclusion, they probably would not be able to dodge such a dense barrage of attacks at such a short distance. Sulu naturally would not be able to do so either. However, just as the defense battalion was firing at full power, a strange change suddenly occurred to the Black Mech. Amidst the rumbling of the bullets, countless crisp sounds could be clearly heard. Those were the sounds of metal colliding with metal and separating from each other. The modified main cannon on the right shoulder of the Black MX Mecha instantly spat out flames. Although it did not carry actual ammunition, this kind of momentum was still shocking. Even as it was falling at a high speed, to the point of almost losing its momentum, the main cannon of the Black Mecha still managed to successfully deal a great deal of damage to the close-range fire control formation of the local defense camp. However, the people in the command center did not have time to assess the casualties of the local defense camp. Instead, they found that the Black Mecha's main cannon had flown up after this round of furious fire. Like a piece of scrap metal, it whistled through the air and shot towards the group of level-firing grenades. Main cannon detached automatically. The staff officers in the command hall could no longer maintain their calm mechanical voices. They reported loudly in shock. Long-range weapon system detached automatically. Platform type cover strip detached. Hidden repair arm detached. Area 41's firmware detached. Auxiliary balancer ejected. The military staff officer's voice was urgent and shocked. However, on the steep slope in front of the command center, everything that was happening to the Black Mecha was happening much faster than his explanation. Following the crisp sound of metal clashing and detaching, countless heavy components were ejected from the Black Mecha's body. In the original design, this type of detachment had a certain initial velocity to prevent damage to the mecha itself. However, at this time, the Black Mecha was already descending at an almost uncontrollable speed. At the same time, the heavy components that were detached from the mecha's body were also moving at a terrifying speed. They were actually sputtering outwards without stopping. Some of the firmware was ejected into the air at high speed. Others were ejected in front of the Black Mecha. As the Black Mecha continued to descend, components were sputtering out of the mecha's body. This scene was extremely strange. It was like a solid black boulder that could not withstand the erosion of thousands of years. It fell from the mountain peak, colliding with each other and sending countless fragments flying everywhere. These splashing components were extremely fast, their mass massive, and they were immensely powerful. They battered the entire hillside into a sorry state, and for some strange reason, they even helped the Black Mecha block several level-fire grenades that were aimed at its hard body. Was this luck or something else? Mecha battle damage, 23%. The military staff officer in the command center stared dumbfoundedly at the image on the screen. He pulled up the data and confirmed that the Black Mecha had still survived the second round of Iron 7 Division's normal shooting. What was even more frightening was that, after this extremely dramatic visual impact of the components peeling off and sputtering, the Black Mecha, which was already moving at an extremely fast speed, seemed to have instantly increased its speed by several notches. The steep peak of MT Bluecake, which was over 1,000 meters long, was actually about to touch the bottom. "Enter overclocking mode," he shouted loudly. There were many people in the command center who had watched Ka Chifeng's battle before. When they saw the Black Mecha's components being detached, they had already guessed that the Black Mecha was preparing to enter overclocking mode. What shocked them was the way the Black Mecha had entered overclocking mode. General Miles narrowed his eyes at the screen. Forcefully entering an overclocking state at such a high speed, yet the high-speed sputtering of components did not cause any problems with the balance of the MX Mecha itself. Could it be that Su Li's level of mecha control had already reached this level? When the Black Mecha appeared on the mountain peak, Du Shaoqing's expression was only occasionally gloomy, but it was immediately back to normal. When the Black Mecha rushed down towards the camp in a valiant manner, he was still sitting on the sofa, his expression as cold as ever, his sunglasses still by his side, unmoving. But when he saw the Black Mecha enter overclocking mode in such a manner, his fingers on the sofa's armrest finally moved. The major beside him glanced at him, but in the end did not hand over the sunglasses. After the shock of the command center, there was silence. Everyone looked at the screen in confusion. Even if it had entered overclocking mode, the Black Mecha was about to turn into a stream of light and smash into the ground. What was that pilot going to do? On the peak of Ka Chifeng, the Purple CMX controlled by Madman Li could not even last 3 minutes of overclocking mode. The Nutshell Standard MX, which used Little White Flower as its prototype, did not have that kind of fatal flaw. However, overclocking was still an overload on the mecha system. Be it the designer or the user, no one would expect to be able to maintain such a crazy and dangerous state forever. Su Lu was both the designer and the user. Naturally, he knew this better than anyone else. He did not know how well the Iron 7th Division's defense battalion was arranged, but he definitely would not underestimate the Iron Blood Army and Shimin Jin, who had single-handedly created by Du Shaoqing. Therefore, he needed to keep the overclocking mode for as long as possible until the most critical moment of the breakout. It was precisely because of this reason that he had always used the conventional mode when he sneaked between the mountains before dawn. Even when he initiated the charge, he still did so. It was not until the last moment when he was forced into a desperate situation by the defensive firepower of the Iron 7th Division that he took off his clothes and threw away his sweaty clothes. Like a newborn bird returning to the forest, like a maiden returning to her first love on the beach, he rushed towards the camp in the valley. Removing the heavy components from the sputtering walls helped him deal with a portion of the dense grenade. This could be said to be luck, but it could also be said to be Su Li's precise control of instantaneous battle situations. Of course, there was also a lot of shamelessness mixed in. After all, this was a drill. When the grenades hit those components, they would only crash to the ground. If this was a real battle, who knew how many explosions would have occurred in front of him? How could the battle damage be maintained within 30%? What should he do next? Looking at the hard ground approaching at high speed on the screen before him, feeling the violent tremors of the MX Mecha as if it was about to fall apart under the high speed, Su Li's eyes behind the goggle-like screen narrowed and shone brightly. His exposed lips pursed tightly, and even his barely budding beard blossomed with a certain fierceness. In that split second, he pressed the red button beside the control stick. With a low grunt, he channeled all the power in his body into his muscles and skin, using the simulation system to control the central system of the mecha. In an instant, the falling black mecha was forcefully pulled back up from the ground. No one could defy the laws of nature, So when the people in the command hall saw the black mecha crash into the ground like a blind tiger, they all thought that the black mecha would not survive. In order to pass through the layers of defensive firepower of the Iron 7th Division, the black mecha had no choice but to engage in a high-speed charge. However, in the end, it seemed that the black mecha would also be destroyed by the high-speed charge. The generals and officers did not close their eyes because they could not bear to watch. They only frowned, very worried about the safety of the pilot. Just a few flashes of lightning and thunder from before had already made them feel a strong sense of respect for the pilot. There were only about 3 people in the hall who still had confidence in the black mecha. General Miles and Minister Zoe looked at the screen calmly. Their confidence came from the attitude of the old man in Philadelphia and Su Li's previous performance. However, the third person was a little strange because it was Du Shaoqing. Du Shaoqing looked coldly at the screen. He definitely did not believe that the black mecha would be stupid enough to commit suicide. Just as he expected, in the next moment, the entire command hall suddenly fell into a collective silence. Everyone looked at the black mecha on the screen, shocked, speechless, as if it had turned into a fossil. At this moment, the image on the screen seemed to have been muted. The scene in the valley camp also seemed to have been muted. There was only a deathly silence. The dense cluster of flaming grenade cannons tried to lift their barrels in vain. The anti-infantry mines that were still exploding seemed to have disappeared as well. Only small mushrooms rose from the steep slope and then dissipated into a sandstorm cloud. In the dead silence, the soldiers of Iron 7 Division, who were as calm as machine parts, finally couldn't help but reveal shocked expressions. Like the spectating officers in the command hall, they raised their heads and looked at the silent picture without any reaction. In the greenish-yellow sandstorm cloud, the silvery-white streamlined wings attached to the waist of the black mecha that was charging down at high speed had already spread out. The black mecha had already left the ground, whistling through the sand and the rain of bullets, and was sprinting towards the camp. At this moment it really flew. Mecha could not fly, and neither could the MX. However, at high speeds, with the help of its perfectly designed wings, it could glide through the air. This was originally designed to be used to forcibly drop mecha into the air, but today, the black mecha that Su Lu was piloting had shown another use for it. In Ka Chifeng's shocking battle, because of the vacuum of the old moon polar region, the wings attached to the 2 MX mechas had only played a part of the role of balance. Today's charge, if not for the terrain to forcibly increase the mecha's speed to the maximum, how could it have been able to glide through the air in such a beautiful curve? The unexpected had to be obtained from the unexpected. Countless people watched as the black mecha soared into the air like a giant black bird, passing through the control fire of the local defense camp. They could not help but be shocked, speechless. This scene would be branded in everyone's minds for a long time. In reality, the black mecha had only stayed in the air for 2 seconds, but it had already forcibly passed through the most concentrated line of fire of the local defense camp to land in the middle of the camp. With a loud boom, the black mecha's alloy mechanical feet landed heavily on the ground. Shards of metal and dirt flew everywhere, and the Iron 7 Division soldiers who were yelling at the top of their lungs fell down in all directions. But what no one expected was that, after the black mecha had passed through the control fire of the local defense camp, it did not directly enter the location of the command center. Instead, before landing, it forcibly twisted its body 30 degrees to the west, aiming for an ordinary barracks at the entrance of Blue Cake Mountain. At this moment, the deathly still scene seemed to have a sound once again. The sound of guns, electronic screams, and the sound of the self-propelled artillery system's motors rang out densely. But the MX mecha had already passed through the middle of the camp. How could these control fire of the local defense camp keep up with its ghostly footstep? Under normal conditions, the black MX was already able to avoid long-range attack. Now that it was in overclocking mode, its trembling body, strange twisting movements, and dazzling fast dodging movements allowed the Black MX to successfully avoid most of the interception and rush towards its target. In the cockpit, Su Li's face was pale. Cold sweat flowed down his face. The heat in his body was quickly draining away. After controlling the MX to perform so many perverted movements, his energy and physical strength had already reached the limit. Most importantly, the damned hunger in his stomach had come to disturb him again. Without hesitation, he controlled the MX to charge towards that ordinary barracks at the fastest speed possible. This was because he knew that Shimanjin was in that ordinary barrack. The room on the right that seemed to be the command center was, in fact, empty. Shimanjin was indeed very careful. Even though the Iron 7th Division had clearly obtained an overwhelming victory, he still made so many strict arrangements in the camp headquarters. That alone was not enough. He had even disguised the command center. This kind of commander was really scary. So when the onboard radar alarm sounded and 4 M52 mecha suddenly appeared in front of the ordinary barracks, Su Lu was not at all surprised. Shimanjin had only used 2/3 of his military strength to forcefully suppress the officers and cadets in the lonely Yellow Mountain Ridge area. The rest of his forces were all placed in the command center. Moreover, these 4 M52 mecha that had been hidden for a long time had been warmed up since the start of the drill, silently guarding this area. This was not a trap set up by Iron 7th Division. This was the meticulous design and strict tactical discipline of the Iron 7th Division that they had learned from Du Shaoqing. A dignified division would not fight an unprepared war. They had to be prepared to the fullest. This way, once the situation changed, any backup plan of the Iron 7th Division could become a trap that could kill the enemy. But so what if it was a trap? Facing the 4 M52 mecha that had their camouflage cloth removed, the heavy mechanical legs of the Black MX quickly moved on the ground, turning into a series of afterimages. It avoided the hail of bullets at an unimaginable speed and closed in on the bodies of the 2 M52 mecha. The Black MX's right alloy fist smashed heavily into the central system of one of the M52 mecha, easily breaking through the sturdy alloy armor. At the same time, its left alloy hand reached out like lightning to fiercely control the right arm of the other M52 that was spraying bullet. The huge difference in power output made the M52 mecha that the military had always been proud of look like a drunkard in front of the Black MX. Moreover, it was completely unable to break free from the Black MX's control. The Carlin barrels of the 2 M52 mecha were still rotating at high speed, spraying bullet. However, they were unable to hit the Black MX between them. Instead, they aimed at each other's chests and abdomens. 2 beautiful streaks of bullet fire splashed into the mecha like electric sparks, instantly destroying each other. Meanwhile, the Black MX controlled by Su Lu pushed up with both arms, shaking off the 2 M52 mecha that had already stopped moving, and with a whoosh, it dove in. It had to be admitted that Su Li's breakout had ultimately taken advantage of many military exercises. If both sides had used live ammunition, in that shocking scene earlier, the 2 M52 mecha would have been forced to shoot at each other. At such a close distance, the high-speed spray of armor-piercing bullets would definitely have hurt the Black MX mecha. The Federation's military exercise combat system was extremely accurate. Once the central control computer confirmed that a mecha had been killed, it would immediately stop working, including the soldiers. After the Black MX had swiftly and valiantly killed the 2 M5 mecha, it then charged towards the normal barrack. At this moment, the Black mecha was like a special forces soldier engaging in close combat, fiercely throwing 14 punches at the remaining 2 M5 mecha. Based on Su Li's understanding of mecha structures, these heavy blows were definitely enough to ensure that these 2 mecha would never have the chance to stand up again. Suddenly, the Black mecha's right mechanical arm reached out, and as quick as lightning, it grabbed one of the already stopped M52 mecha and threw it viciously to the right. The Black MX mecha was about the same weight as the M-series mecha, but after stripping off the components and entering an overclock state, its body appeared much slimmer in comparison. However, with its powerful twin engines outputting 4 times the power output, it was actually able to easily grab the M52 mecha and throw it. This scene was very strange. It was as if a delicate woman with a frosty expression had picked up a burly man and thrown him away like a sandbag. Of course, the Black mecha had not done this to vent, but to humiliate the Iron 7th Division. The M52 mecha it had thrown accurately hit a self-propelled heavy cannon 50 meters to the right. That modified self-propelled heavy cannon did not even have time to blast out the electromagnetic beam bomb that mecha feared the most before it was smashed all over the ground by this ruined mecha that had been thrown over. The graphite beams that shot out were extremely magnetic as they stuck to the ruined mecha and began to flash with blue electric arcs. This pitiful mecha that had been used as a sandbag twitched uncontrollably. The Black mecha shuddered as it moved at high speed, clearing out all the targets in its path one by one. It twisted its body forcefully in midair, using an extremely beautiful pose to transform into a phantom, nimbly dodging the 4 incoming rocket projectiles by a hair's breadth. Speed. What it needed was speed. The Black mecha pushed its speed to the limit. Whether it was the 4 hidden mechas, the electromagnetic beam bomb, or the individual rocket projectiles that were impossible to defend against, none of them could stop the Black mecha's footsteps for even a moment. Before the remaining armored soldiers of the Iron 7th Division could surround it, the Black mecha had already inconceivably crossed 70 meters in a second. With one foot, it overturned an electronically linked armored vehicle. With a shake of its body, it rushed to the front of the ordinary barrack and smashed open the door with a punch. In the barrack, the officers and staff of the Iron 7th Division looked at the Black mecha outside the door, their expressions extremely ugly. The Black mecha was like a skilled assassin that could kill with a single strike. It didn't give them much time to react. Shimin-Jin, whose hair was a little dry, turned around and glanced at the Black mecha. She was about to say something. However, the pilot in the Black mecha did not have the demeanor of an assassin. Before Shimin-Jin could speak, the pilot in the Black mecha lifted its heavy mechanical arm and completed the last designated action through the control system. Under the burning gazes of the officers of the Iron 7th Division, the Black mecha's right alloy arm pointed directly at the highest commander here, Shimin-Jin. Chapter 341. The Black MX mecha had already stripped away all of its long-range firepower systems. Right now, facing the gloomy Iron 7th Division officers from outside the barracks, if it wanted to complete its tactical objective, it could only rely on the mecha's movements. In other words, Shimin-Jin could only be trampled to death, beaten to death, and tortured to death by the Black mecha. Sulu didn't want to humiliate the opponent, but this was the only way he could fight. Of course, he couldn't really break through the door and use his heavy mechanical legs to trample Shimin-Jin into minced meat. He could only enter the next step into the battle damage system in the Military Exercise Command Center. Through precise calculations, the command center directly determined that his actions were effective. In the next moment, the Military Exercise Command Center and the officers and soldiers of the Iron 7th Division all received a notification from the battle damage system. The Blue Team commander has died. The officers and generals in the command center couldn't hide their shock as they watched the image on the screen. The Black mech rushed down from the top of Blue Pond Peak. The smoke and cannons exploded. In just a few moments, this MX had already successfully broken through the barracks, completing this mission that seemed impossible to complete in the first place. General Miles's white eyebrows bloomed as he sighed softly in relief. The Minister of Defense, Zhou Yingxing, calmly picked up the cup of tea beside him and took a sip. The tea was already cold, but he didn't react at all. It seemed that this military big shot was hiding a lot of emotions under his calm exterior. Then, everyone's eyes turned to the right side of the command center. The Federal Army officers were very curious. What kind of expression would the usually cold and arrogant Division Commander Du Shaoqing have after witnessing the defeat of his own troops? To their surprise and slight disappointment, although Division Commander Du Shaoqing had already stood up, his expression was still cold, his posture dignified, and his figure straight. He didn't seem to have suffered such a heavy blow at all. Of course, some people still noticed that Division Commander Du's hands were clenched tightly behind his back. His knuckles were faintly white. The soldiers in the military drill hall were shocked by the performance of the Black Mecha, marveling at the unimaginable level of control displayed by the pilot. Du Shaoqing was the same. Other than anger and gloom in his heart, he also felt a strong sense of incomprehension. As an all-rounder in military affairs, Division Commander Du Shaoqing's mecha piloting skills were also quite outstanding. However, after seeing Su Lu operate the Black MX with his own eyes, he could not use a logical deduction to convince himself that this was something a normal person could do. Du Shaoqing's face was cold and detached as he looked at the Black Mecha and his subordinates on the screen. His brows furrowed. Those straight eyebrows that had always been like unsheathed swords seemed to have been resheathed at this moment. They became silent, as if they were waiting for something to happen. A moment later, another exclamation rang out in the military exercise command hall. The military staff officer, who had completely lost his cool today, stood up from behind the workbench and loudly reported, "Mecha damage 61%, 88%. 100%, the Black MX has exploded." The military exercise command hall suddenly fell into a state of busy calculations and shocked discussions. The staff officers could not understand why the Black MX had suddenly exploded after successfully breaking through the camp. The armored squad of the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion had not yet arrived. What exactly happened in the command center? General Miles, who was sitting on the sofa, was stunned. He frowned and immediately thought of the part of the battle force that the Iron 7th Division had not used during this impromptu military exercise. After a moment of silence, a look of appreciation appeared on his face. Du Shaoqing looked at the screen expressionlessly. That pair of eyebrows of his raised again. Although it was not as insufferably arrogant and unstoppable as before, it had recovered some of its luster. From the beginning of the military exercise until now, the Defense Battalion under the command of Shimanjin had not used that fixed-speed non-cruise missile unit. He believed that his soldiers would not disappoint him to the extreme. The unforeseen event happened too quickly. The command system had just reported the news of the Blue Team's commander's death, when a sharp alarm rang out from the central control system of the mecha. Looking at the red energy lines blotting out the sky and covering the Earth on the full-view radar screen, Su Lu could not help but sweat profusely, drenching his back in the stuffy cockpit, even though he knew that this was all virtual. Different from the level-fire howitzers from before, a dense cluster of missiles flew in from an unknown base and covered the entire area around the barrack. It did not distinguish between friend and foe and carried out a powerful attack. The power of the missiles was set to explode, and on the virtual screen, the entire barracks turned into a sea of fire. Almost at the same time as the command hall, the battle damage system connected to the Black Mecha coldly and mechanically reported the battle damage situation. In just the blink of an eye, the Black MX, which had not yet lost 30% of its battle force, had its red column representing the status of the mecha drop continuously as if it was rapidly losing blood. In the end, the system determined that the mecha had exploded. During this process, the Black Mecha had no time to react at all. Faced with the high-speed missiles that blotted out the sky and covered the Earth, even if it could react, it would not be able to complete any evasive maneuvers. It could only watch as its body was buried in the sea of fire. A deathly silence. Su Lu narrowed his eyes as he stared intently at the data feedback on the screen. Listening to the cold voice of the system, He pondered in silence for a long time before he finally understood the source of all this. A fixed-velocity non-cruise missile unit. The Military Exercise Command System had added a group of virtual soldiers for both sides of the exercise, and what had been added to the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion was this two-base missile unit. During the exercise that had started before dawn, the Iron 7th Division had not used this unit at all. They had actually been suppressing it all this time until the very end, when they finally aimed at their own command center and launched a barrage of attacks without distinguishing friend from foe. This virtual unit was equipped with the Stinger II missile, which had terrifying absolute speed. However, it also had an extremely fatal flaw. The direct injection vortex engine made it impossible for this type of fast missile to perform precise navigation. Therefore, using this type of light missile to attack the powerful MX mecha from a distance would be very difficult to achieve any result. However, Shimin-Jin had placed the missile base in the valley behind Blue Pool Mountain, and aimed it at her own command center. This excellent and meticulous commander had maintained absolute self-control and calm throughout the entire exercise, saving this force for the very end. Even when Su Li's Black Mecha had charged down from the mountain peak, due to the flaw of the Stinger II missile, the Black Mecha had still not been willing to fire recklessly. Only when the Black Mecha had penetrated deep into camp headquarters and was within the absolute range of the missile cluster did Shimin-Jin launch a devastating attack. At such a close distance, with such a high density of continuous fire, the Stinger II missile did not need a cruise system at all to blast any enemy into pieces. If the Black Mecha had been in the valley at this time, it would probably have been able to rely on its mobility to dodge this wave of attack. However, at this time, the Black Mecha had succeeded in its mission and was no longer vigilant. Most importantly, this wave of missiles had been coldly aimed at its location. How could it escape? Inside the glowing red cockpit, Su Li pondered in silence for a very long time before he finally managed to sort out the sequence of events. Using the Stinger II missile against a mecha, only Shimin-Jin's method could achieve tactical result. However, what made him feel even colder was that the Iron 7th Division had actually buried the entire command center with it, wanting to bury him here. This kind of design was a little too cruel. He rubbed his stiff face, shook his head, and pressed the button to open the cockpit. Accompanied by the sound of hydraulic systems and motors, the cockpit of the Black Mecha at the entrance to the command center of the Iron 7th Division's defense camp slowly opened. At this time, the Military Exercise Command System had already determined that all personnel near the command center were dead, so the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division could only stare at the open cockpit door with ugly expressions. They did not raise their weapons to aim at the enemy. Although this Black Mecha had exploded and died in the end, the other party had broken into their camp and killed 4 of their own mecha in an instant. In the end, they had even killed their highest commanding officer. This was the equivalent of a tight slap to their faces. The pale-faced Su Li crawled out of the cockpit, but he did not climb down to the ground. Instead, he stood on the alloy railings and looked down at the angry Iron 7th Division officers with narrowed eyes. Although he had been determined to be dead in the end, he had done everything he could. He had successfully broken into camp and killed the enemy's commander, so there was a hint of youthful excitement in his calm mood. There was no regret or sadness. "You're really ruthless." Su Li felt unusually tired. He wiped the sweat off his forehead with his fingers and sat down on the slightly hot mecha. Leaning against the tough alloy armor, he looked down at the gloomy commander in the barracks and said seriously, "I admit that Iron 7th Division has the right to be proud." These were sincere words. In today's impromptu military exercise, Zhou Yu's group of officers who were born in the Lonely Mountain and Yellow Mountain Ridge area had displayed their strongest abilities. Otherwise, they would not have been able to delay the large number of soldiers of the defense camp for so long and give Su Li a chance to break into camp. However, in the face of Iron 7th Division's well-trained and unusually calm offensive, The red team could only lose. What was even more frightening was that Su Lu had cheated and had the ability to operate a mecha that few people in this world understood. He had displayed the performance of the Black MX to the extreme and unexpectedly broke into the camp. In the end, he had encountered 3 layers of backup from Iron 7th Division. Although he had succeeded in killing the enemy's commander in the end, he had also ushered in death. Shimin Jin sat in the barracks with a calm expression. He did not pick up the coffee cup in his hand again. His mood was not as calm as his expression. He had long been boiling with anger. He had commanded the most powerful defense camp of Iron 7th Division, but he had actually been broken in by a single Black MX. The commander had been killed? What kind of humiliation was this? He did not raise his head to speak to Su Lu on the Black Mecha, because that would make people feel that Su Lu was looking down at him with the attitude of a victor. Chapter 342. The battle at the front line of Lonely Ridge had just ended a minute ago. The military exercise command system had used the fastest speed to determine the outcome. Although the red team had successfully killed the blue team's commander, the red team's final members had all been killed. The blue team had completed the final tactical mission, so the system determined the blue team's victory. Hearing the notification of victory, Shimin Jin's expression became more and more unsightly. How could this kind of victory taste good? I never thought of using the sharp stinger type 2. In the valley, I was just being cautious out of habit. However, I really didn't think that your side would actually have a mecha that could break into my command center. Just when the camp command center was deathly silent, Shimin Jin suddenly opened her mouth and said, "But there is one thing that I don't understand no matter how I think about it. To pass through my electronic detection, your mecha must have entered the automatic electronic shield. Then how were you able to find my camp?" This commander finally raised his head and looked at the exhausted Su Lu sitting on the mecha. He asked, "Not only did you find the camp, you even guessed that this room was the real command center. How did you do it?" Shimin Jin used a philosophical tone, frowning as he supported himself on the table and asked the question that had puzzled him for a long time. The humiliation of being successfully broken into by the opponent had magnified the questions and shock in his heart by countless times. Thus, he would rather raise his head and look at the high and mighty Su Lu and ask aloud. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division around the Blue Pool Valley gradually gathered. There were about 150 of them, and all of them had already been determined to be dead by the command system. The soldiers looked at the black mecha disguised as the entrance of the command center. They looked at the young pilot leaning against the body of the mecha. Their faces were ashen, and the hostility in their gazes was almost enough to cause some kind of substantial harm. Su Lu was Dong Lin's stone. He would never be affected by the emotions of his enemies. He would not be moved by external things. His face was like a hard stone covering the outside of a stone, blocking out all these gazes. After a moment of silence, he looked at Shimin Jin below the mecha and said, "Yesterday, when Instructor Du was lecturing the officer students, he said that soldiers should have a gambling spirit. I just took a gamble. Looks like my luck is not bad and I won the gamble." Shimin Jin looked at him with gloomy expression and said, "Who will believe these words?" Su Lu was speechless. He thought to himself that he couldn't possibly dance around on the mecha and then sing in a hoarse voice, "This is a little secret, I won't tell you, I'll tell you." Looking at Du Shaoqing's cold style, Shimin Jin, who was sitting firmly in the camp and was still trying her best to imitate Du Shaoqing's cold style even though she had died miserably, Su Lu looked at the string of pale yellow radiance on the head of this outstanding commander and wanted to tell the other party, "Not only do I know where your headquarters is, I even know that you are a citizen of Donglin, and you are 35 years old this year." However, looking at Shimin Jin's bloodshot eyes and dry and unnatural hair, Su Lu didn't say anything in the end as he thought of the other party's current mood. He maintained his composure under the hateful gazes of the Iron 7th Division soldiers surrounding him and didn't appear to be too happy. At noon, the troops participating in the military exercise finally retreated one by one. Although it was only a small impromptu military exercise, a battle on the scale of 1,000 people, transporting the damaged equipment back, was already quite troublesome. What was even more troublesome was that the soldiers who had been injured by the flying debris during the Black Mecca's breakout needed to be treated in time. Fortunately, there were no real fatalities. Even so, although the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division who had retreated were as silent and calm as usual, anyone could find a different emotion in their eyes: unwillingness and intense anger. This anger was not directed at the Red Team officer students in the exercise, but rather at this unexpected outcome, this embarrassing victory. What kind of army was the Iron 7th Division? The brotherly troops who had suffered a dismal ending in 37 military exercises knew best. They were as solemn as winter to the enemy, and as harsh as the harshest of art connoisseurs who refused to accept red packets from cultural foundations. They were extremely strict in their management, and on the battlefield, they cruelly demanded that there be no loopholes. The problem was that in this impromptu military exercise, they didn't think that they had done anything wrong, but they still lost, so they were angry. At the same time, they also had countless complex emotions towards the pilot who had piloted the Black Mecca. There was hatred, confusion, shock, and all kinds of emotions mixed together, but they still returned to the original point: anger. On the military airport, heavy transport aircraft were taking off and landing non-stop. Heavy transport helicopters whizzed past like large birds. Further away, transport spaceships were on standby. Soldiers with orderly footsteps walked across the road with stern expressions. The entire base was filled with a busy and solemn atmosphere. Jean, whose dry black hair was messy in the wind, led the staff officers of the defense battalion and walked at the front of the line. Her expression was very ugly, and even when she walked into the warehouse of the base, the expression on her face didn't change at all. Unlike the anger of the Iron 7th Division, the military officers who were in line couldn't hide the smile on their faces. All of them who had represented the Red Team had died or been captured, and they had just been released by the main force of the Iron 7th Division. Everyone should have been dejected, with a face full of grief and indignation, doing their duty as a loser, but they just smiled and looked outside the warehouse. In this military exercise, the performance of the military officers was actually very outstanding. Relying on the 7MXs and the virtual forces transferred by the central computer, they actually managed to hold the main force of the defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division at the front line of the lonely Yellow Mountain Ridge for more than an hour. This bought precious time and opportunity for Su Lu to break through the camp. But after being scolded like a snowstorm by Du Shaoqing yesterday afternoon, they couldn't be proud of this kind of thing. The reason for their pride was the black MX that was slowly being lowered by the heavy helicopter outside the warehouse. Su Lu, wearing a black high-energy material pilot suit, rubbed his sweaty hair, dragged the heavy black workbench box, and walked at the back of the line into the warehouse where the participating soldiers were lined up. The moment he appeared in front of everyone, Zhou Yu, who had a gentle smile on his face, and Hua Xiaoxi, whose left shoulder was injured, were the first to start clapping. Although close to 1,000 Iron 7 Division officers and men were looking ahead without any movement, the 30-odd trainees, 17 men from Team 7, and the staff officers in the base were applauding fervently. It was as if there was a thunderstorm, as if there was a clap of thunder in spring. Su Lu was slightly taken aback, but then he narrowed his eyes and smiled. He raised his hand and waved in the direction of the trainees. Then he heard the sharp whistles and cheers of the 7th Division. Hearing the applause, whistles, and cheers, the expressions of the Iron 7th Division soldiers, who had been cold and calm, became even more gloomy. Listening to the applause, Su Lu thought back to the day when the MX Mecha had been successfully developed in the underground storeroom of the Nutshell Engineering Department in the Harbor City Industrial Park. When he and Shang Qiu had walked into the quiet storeroom, what had greeted them had also been such a moving applause. Suddenly, he had the urge to call Shang Qiu and tell her about this scene. The biggest difference between glory and vanity was whether or not you had done the right thing for this sense of glory. If the glory Su Lu enjoyed after the military exercise was vanity, he wouldn't reject it. He would only enjoy it, and he would be willing to enjoy it monotonously and repeatedly. Minister Zhou and General Myers didn't participate in the inspection after the military exercise. The two most powerful big shots in the military had to leave some face for the Iron 7th Division. After all, the final victor of the military exercise was the Iron 7th Division. If they were there, they would have to be kind to Su Lu and protect him. Where would the dignity of the Iron 7th Division go? In addition, these two big shots probably also thought that Su Lu was already in a pot of oil right now, so there was no need to give him too much face and splash a ladle of alcohol on him. What ended the thunderous applause in the warehouse was another round of monotonous and dull applause. The commander of the Iron 7th Division, Du Shaoqing, had a calm expression on his face. He looked at Su Lu, who walked in with a box and clapped lightly with his hands that were wearing lambskin glove. The applause was somewhat dull, so the applause in the warehouse quietened down. Complete silence. Su Lu walked to the front of the formation and gave a military salute. The reception after the military exercise ended very quickly. The federal military needed this exercise to change the inherent tactical thinking of many of the generals. But in reality, if one carefully analyzed these two exercises, the Iron 7th Division led by Du Shaoqing was actually the unit that didn't need to be hammered the least. The nimble and precise tactical design allowed the Iron 7th Division to seamlessly coordinate with the MX Mecha's powerful attack. The soldiers in the warehouse gradually dispersed. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division gathered together, and the officers and men of the Iron 7th Division naturally gathered together. Lan Xiaolong glanced at Shimanjin, who walked past him, and said, "I'm really sorry we lost again. But please believe me, we didn't go easy on you." In order to cover for Su Li's black MX Mecha going deep into the mountains, the Iron 7th Division had no choice but to expose themselves. All of them were surrounded. Lan Xiaolong was pitifully captured, but in front of the Iron 7th Division, he didn't feel like a captive at all. Nearly 1,000 Iron 7th Division soldiers heard these provocative words, and their expressions turned ugly. But in the end, they couldn't stage a gang fight in front of so many high-ranking military officials in the warehouse. Even Shimanjin only paused for a moment before leaving the scene. Zhou Yu patted Lan Xiaolong's shoulder and indicated for him to look outside the warehouse. In reality, most of the soldiers on the field had already cast their gazes outside. The sun above the mountains was gradually moving westward, and dusk was gradually thickening. In the light red background, on a protruding hill, two figures stood facing each other. It was like a scene out of a paper cut. Du Shaoqing and Su Lu. I took the traffic rules test during the day. I'm really old, but I'm a genius. I finished it in 5 minutes, and they didn't let me leave. I endured it for 15 minutes, 100. Although I know it's easy, I really only watched it for one night. How can I not be narcissistic? Wahahaha. Chapter 343. Your comrades are all dead. Du Shaoqing looked calmly at the red clouds on the narrow flat land between the mountains in the distance. His gloved hands were behind his back as he asked, "If you were facing an entire mechanical regiment, would you be able to charge into the regiment headquarters?" This Federation's youngest major general did not deliberately take off his gloves in front of Su Lu because of yesterday's conflict. His heart, which had been honed for many years in the military, could no longer be affected by such small matters. Su Lu was silent for a long time before he said, "I can't do it now, but that doesn't mean I can't do it in the future. He understood the meaning of this conversation between Du Shaoqing and himself, so he decided not to give in at all. Du Shaoqing looked at him coldly and said, "Even if you can, no one else can." This was a judgment that directly hit the nail on the head regarding this military exercise. If not for the help of the glory of the Charter, if not for the tyrannical methods that the uncle had taught him, how could Su Lu have done all this? He could do it, but the other ace pilots of the Federation military could not do it. This was a feat that could not be repeated, so it could not become a template for the Federation military. "You're not a qualified commander." Du Shaoqing looked at him coldly and said coldly, "And you'll never be able to become a qualified commander in the future." Su Lu silently agreed with this judgment, but when he felt the coldness and faint contempt in this person's words and thought of the killing intent he had felt yesterday, his heart suddenly hardened. He raised his head and said, "Commander, that qualified commander of yours has just been killed by me." Du Shaoqing was not as angry as he had been yesterday. He had already sunk all his disgust toward this young man into his bones. He looked at Su Lu and said, "The Federation has a modern military system. If a commander dies, there's still a replacement. This is also why the Military Exercise Command Hall still judged the blue team to be the winner even though you successfully broke through the camp and killed Shimin Jin. The Federation has a modern military system, but the Empire doesn't." Su Lu looked at him and said, "Marshal Li killed the Emperor of the Empire, and the Empire was forced to retreat. The President of the Federation is dead, but there's still the Vice President and the Deputy Speaker, but they can't. We're training our soldiers to fight the Empire, not the Iron 7th Division." This was almost a quibble, but it was impossible to find a problem with it. Du Shaoqing's thick eyebrows, which were like heavy swords, trembled. He was silent, but the fists behind his back were clenched. Su Lu stood quietly by his side, looking at the man's firm and resolute face under the twilight. He thought to himself, given the man's lofty status and fanatical support in the Iron 7 Division, if he really died, the Iron 7 Division would be destroyed as well. Du Shaoqing seemed to have guessed what Su Lu was thinking. He looked into the distance and said indifferently, "If I personally commanded the military exercise troops, do you think your MX would be able to kill me?" This sentence was very calm, but it was mixed with endless confidence and strong deterrence, making it difficult for anyone to doubt it, including Su Lu. He pursed his dry lips and repeated what he said before, "You can't do it now, but it doesn't mean you can't do it in the future. You're not a marshal. You defeated Madman Li once and destroyed the Imperial Guard Battalion once, but it doesn't mean you can go anywhere in the universe." Du Shaoqing looked at him indifferently, not hiding the disgust in his heart. After 2 days of military exercise, Su Lu had gradually caught on to the complex reasons why Commander Du disliked him. This condescending and oppressive hostility came from Park Ji-ho, from the 2 officers he killed, from the old man in Philadelphia, but more than that, it came from the philosophy and the unpredictable future of the army. In fact, from a certain point of view, even Su Lu admitted that Commander Du Shaoqing and his 7th Division were walking the right path of military management. Su Lu was just following the old path of the Li brothers, walking on an old path that could not be replicated or promoted. It was not the normal path, but he did have the ability to not walk the normal path. Uncle Feng Yu once praised Su Li's ability to see through people's minds. This ability was even better than his mechanical engineering talent. The reason why he had this ability was probably because Su Lu could maintain an absolutely calm and clean heart under high-speed thinking, so his gaze was extremely penetrating. After being together for several years, he could still feel the indifference in the depths of the uncle's heart. If they had only met for the first time in life, he had already grasped a certain wave band that was deeply hidden in Shi Qinghai's source of darkness. The acquaintance was cold and the friendship was absurd. However, he had calmly accompanied Zhou Yu on a crucial journey. The The reason why he had become close friends with the three of them was that he could see through their truest thoughts. If there was a mistake in judgment, it was probably only by Yulan. With this kind of insight, Su Lu could see through Du Shaoqing's heart. It was not a difficult thing. "Commander, you want to be the second Li Pifu, the Second Federation's god of war?" Su Lu narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the dusk on the horizon. He said, "But I don't. I know that I'm just a piece of material that can withstand training, but it's difficult to assemble into the big machine that is the army, and I don't have the ability to drive the group forward. So, I don't want to be the second Li Pifu, I just want to be the only Su Lu." Du Shaoqing was silent for a moment. After laughing out of anger yesterday, he returned to his cold expression. Listening to Su Li's words, no one knew if he would be moved, but at least on the surface, he was still a cold and iron-blooded commander. "When I was studying in No. 1 Academy, Li Jiedu was an instructor in our department. He is now the vice dean of No. 1 Academy." Du Shaoqing said in a deep voice, "Someone from the constellation has appeared. I hope you won't disappoint me. See you in the West Woods." After saying this, the representative of the young generation of the federal military walked down the hill in an extremely straightforward manner, leaving Su Lu with only a rather awe-inspiring back view. Li Jiedu was the son of the old man in Philadelphia and Madman Li's father. Why did Du Shaoqing suddenly say this? Was it just because he was lamenting that there was suddenly an anomaly like Su Lu in the army? Watching Du Shaoqing walk down the hill, surrounded by the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division, Su Li's heart was filled with complex emotions. What made him extremely vigilant was that the tone of Du Shaoqing's last conversation with him was so calm. The coldness and murderous intent from the day before had been completely wiped out. There was a type of person in this world who was born with a certain temperament. Those who held grudges and protected those who were close to them would be seen as quick to repay kindness and revenge. Those who were cold and bloodthirsty would be seen as iron-blooded. Even if he was standing in a pile of black ores, he would still be as dazzling as a diamond. Even if he was in the midst of miasma and poisonous fog, he would still breathe like ice, giving people a sense of what it meant to be aloof from the world. In the bustling world, in the midst of millions of people, you would be able to see him as soon as you looked up. There was no doubt that Du Shaoqing was this type of person. He calmly left the warehouse, his military posture still perfect and precise. His well-ironed military uniform and his person were still calm, confident and elegant, with a hint of bloody rust. Although the victory of the Iron 7th Division today was a little embarrassing, the soldiers who watched him leave still dared not look down on this division commander. If the two military exercises were personally commanded by this person, what would the result be? Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked over there. His gaze moved from Du Shaoqing's back to Du Shaoqing's dry black hair behind him, then back to Du Shaoqing's upright body. His eyebrows gradually furrowed. Such a person had the intention to kill him, but he immediately wiped it clean. He was afraid that he would become even more dangerous. The next day, the base held a meeting with the high-ranking military officers. After the meeting, Du Shaoqing didn't even attend the meal. He directly took the spaceship to the old moon base, then transferred to the space battleship and embarked on the journey back to S3. The federal military had long been used to this division commander's behavior, so they wouldn't be so narrow-minded as to think that he was holding a grudge because the military exercises didn't go well. In the dark blue universe, a space battleship full of mechanical beauty was moving forward at a seemingly slow speed. In the luxurious cockpit, the guard officer, Shimin Jin, received a phone call and handed it to Du Shaoqing. Du Shaoqing was slightly startled. After taking the phone, he immediately stood up and said a few words in a deep voice. His attitude was abnormally serious and proper. There were only two people in the cockpit, Du Shaoqing and Shimin Jin. Naturally, no one saw this scene. Otherwise, they would definitely be surprised to see who was on the other side of the phone and who could make the usually cold and silent division commander Do stand up and stand at attention from tens of thousands of kilometers away. After putting down the phone, Du Shaoqing sat upright in the chair and slowly took off his sunglasses. His deep, statue-like eyes were filled with hidden anger and gloominess. His emotions had nothing to do with this phone call. In fact, from a long time ago, he had incomparably respected and trusted the other party. It was precisely because of the other party's sincere request that he had been forcefully suppressing his anger towards Su Lu in the base. Thinking of the young man with small eyes and the words the other party had whispered in his ear about flipping out, Du Shaoqing's expression became gloomy. He thought faintly in his heart, a professional soldier will never shoot his comrades in the back on the battlefield. However, if you violate military discipline in the future… Su Lu, don't blame me for being ruthless. Shimanjin was silent to the side. His military cap was pressed extremely low, covering all of his hair. The sunglasses in Du Shaoqing's hand had already been crushed, revealing some extremely intricate pieces of circuit component. During the military exercises, he didn't conduct remote command. This was his pride. However, his pride was being wantonly challenged by a small fry. It was really difficult for him to let go. Du Shaoqing silently told himself in his heart, "Your journey is the sea of stars." In an instant, his emotions calmed down. He slowly turned his head to look at the majestic view of outer space outside the window. He was silent for a long time. At the same time, Su Lu was sitting on the stone steps of the training ground of the base. He held a bottle of ale in his hand and looked up at the starry sky. He narrowed his eyes and looked at those ancient existences blinking their eyes. Suddenly, he thought of the words on the bracelet on his left hand and thought of some very complicated things. Iron 7 Division and Du Shaoqing were still undefeated, but he himself had shone brightly. Other than raising the status of the MX Mecha, did the federal military have some other deeper meaning in organizing these two exercises? Chapter 344. In the twilight, when he had a conversation with Du Shaoqing, there was not much sharpness or momentum, but Su Lu was a naive child. He did not think that this person's intention to kill him had really disappeared. On the contrary, he became more vigilant. A capable and powerful person was always watching his back. This kind of danger was no less than facing the rain of bullets at the Golden Foundation building. Regarding the victory of the military exercise, it seemed that he had cheated. Su Li's big heart would not soften in front of the Iron 7 Division. He had already cheated, so it was very hypocritical of him to blame himself morally and emotionally side with the enemy. Moreover, in a sense, this was not cheating. It was just his unique secret ability that no one knew about, and for this ability, he had to run and wander in the Federation. He was in a coma and had no idea how many days he had lived in fear and anxiety. In the end, it was still the same sentence. If you only met for the first time in life and did not see each other again, then you would either miss the beauty, conflict, or hatred until death. The god of war Li Pifu and the iron-blooded division commander Du Shaoqing were both role models of professional soldiers. They belonged to the same school, but Su Lu and Uncle Feng Yu belonged to the opposite school. Although there were some crucial differences between Li Pifu and Du Shaoqing, and between Mechanic Feng Yu and Mechanic Su Lu, with Su Li's experience and ability, he could not decipher it for the time being. It was probably like the enmity between Feng Yu and Li Pifu in Philadelphia. Because of the different schools of thought, Su Lu had an innate resistance to Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division. People like Du Shaoqing and the soldiers of the Iron 7 Division, who were always cold and emotionless, should have been hated by the federal military. But strangely, the soldiers respected Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7 Division more than they hated them. Su Lu could not feel any respect or awe. As a fugitive from the Federation, he plunged headfirst into the great circle of fame and fortune in the capital ring. Like the tiny stars in the bracelet on his left hand, he was used to freely shining in the open space. So when he looked at Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7 Division, he felt uncomfortable and upset. After looking at the stars in the sky for a while, Su Lu used the malt wine bottle in his hand to support his tired body. He bent over and vomited in great discomfort. Coincidentally, he vomited into an empty space on the stone step. This empty space was where Xiong Linquan had opened the stone steps a few days ago when his godly power had erupted. It was not because he had drunk too much. Rather, it was because when the mecha had breached the camp, Su Lo had squeezed out all the burning energy in his body. His stomach had been empty to the extreme, and after he had overdosed on gastric acid, he had also eaten and drunk too much for the past day and night. So, his stomach had developed some problems. The Black MX mecha had breached the camp in a seemingly simple, direct, and elegant manner, but only Su Lo himself knew how much he had paid for it. Even with his abilities, his body had suffered great damage from using the simulation system to control such a heavy mecha. "Looks like my body is still not a machine after all," muttered Su Lu to himself as he wiped his mouth and thought of the uncle's teachings back then. Su Lu enjoyed the impromptu military drill battle to his heart's content. Because of the old man in Philadelphia, he no longer had to deliberately hide his tremor qigong. Even if some people suspected a certain most wanted criminal, who would dare to investigate if he pushed the blame to the Li family. The military drill had brought many benefits to Su Lu. Putting aside the rewards from the military for the time being, Mr. Shi's special pardon order was also out of the question for now. At least his days at the base had become much better. Trained officers were the proudest soldiers, and the 17 men of Team 7 were the hardest subordinates to train. However, after this battle, everything had changed. The strength Su Lu had displayed in the military drill, and the most important thing was the condensation and sublimation of this collective sense of honor in the flames of war. This had made his position in the hearts of the students and the members of Team 7 rise qualitatively. Seeing this scene, the happiest person was not Su Lu, but Lan Xiaolong and some of the higher-ups in the military. Secretary Bai was still recovering in the hospital. Although the stab was not fatal, it was not shallow. Without him here, all of the pressure was transferred to Major Lan Xiaolong. His mission was originally to mediate the relationship between Su Lu and the members of Team 7. Although he did not know what the higher-ups of the Ministry of Defense were doing, he knew that Team 7 would definitely accept a very important mission in the future. And before this mission was carried out, Team 7 and the core of the military, Su Lu, must become an unbreakable group. Looking at the military jeep in the distance, Lan Xiaolong had a trace of a smile on his face. Lu Jiao was dragging Su Lu and Xiong Linquan into the mountains to hunt rabbits to improve their meals. This blatant method of going against the HDD Bureau seemed to indicate that a small group was gradually forming. 3 days later, in the slightly bleak autumn wind, the training officers in the base forcibly changed their reluctance to leave into a kind of steely bear hug and salute. They bid farewell to Su Lu and the members of Team 7, who were the last ones to stay behind, and boarded the military planes that returned to their respective units. Su Lu looked at the aircraft leaving the runway, listened to the whistling sound, and smelled the faint burnt smell. His eyes habitually narrowed. His relationship with these officers had become extremely harmonious, but he had to say goodbye. The next time he saw them would probably be on the battlefield against the Empire, or in front of the Federation Heroes Cemetery? Thinking of this, even though he was young, he couldn't help but feel some indescribable emotions. The emotions quickly disappeared because Su Lu and his Team 7 also received a vacation order from the Ministry of Defense. However, along with the rare vacation, there was also a secret order that they did not expect. Lan Xiaolong looked at the order that was signed by the relevant department of the Ministry of Defense and the president of Whitewater Company. His expression became ugly. After the Ministry of Defense requested Team 7 to undergo training, coupled with the rumors about Su Lo, he had been mentally prepared to go to the front line. However, he did not expect Team 7 to accept this mission. We were transferred from the army to go to the front line to kill the enemy. Why did we go back to Whitewater? Xiong Linquan frowned, but he was not worried. Instead, he was particularly fierce and angry. He said loudly, "We are soldiers, not the bodyguards of those stupid rich girls." The computer operator of Team 7 was called Gu Shifeng. He looked at the order and raised his eyebrows. He laughed and said, "I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Our Team 7 is originally from the Security Consulting Department. Although we have never done security work before, what's there to be afraid of?" Xiong Linquan angrily glared at him. He wondered why Team 7 had such a piece of trash. Gu Shifeng said with great yearning, "Too bad this is a top-secret order. Otherwise, I really want to call my girlfriend. If she knew that I could work beside this young lady every day, wouldn't she be overjoyed?" Lan Xiaolong frowned. He thought that even if the target of protection was a national defense idol who was welcomed by the entire Federation, it did not make sense for the powerful Team 7 to be her bodyguards. Most importantly, the current supervisor of Team 7 was Su Lo. This young master had the most terrifying mountain in the Federation behind him. The military was clearly focused on training him, but now he was not allowed to go to the front line in the West Woods. Instead, he was assigned to guard the house. This was too unreasonable. Su Lo looked at the 3 words Jianshuer on the order. While he was shocked, he could not help but feel endless doubts. He had not seen the name of this national idol girl for a long time. He also knew that Sister Tong had wanted him to be her bodyguard a long time ago. The question was, how could the military be so stupid as to turn him and Team 7, who were supposed to be the tip of the spear, into a group of bored people wearing sunglasses and playing with paper balls? If things were abnormal, there must be something wrong. Su Lo had never denied his feelings. Even though he had come into close contact with Jian Shuer under the sunlight of the 1st Military Region's General Hospital, that woman was still his dream lover. She was definitely his idol. This was the deepest imprint of adolescence. However, to be her bodyguard, there was something strange hidden in this abnormal arrangement. He couldn't help but think deeply about it. After all, he wasn't fighting alone now. There were more than 10 men following behind him. The vacation officially began. When the members of Team 7 walked out of the capital military airport in single file, Su Lo paused for a moment and suddenly said to Xiong Linquan, "When will Bai Yulan's injury be healed?" On the outskirts of the capital, there was a building at the end of a dead-end road. In the entire Federation, this building had the strictest security level. It was even higher than the President's official residence and the Management Committee building. It was often called the Parliament Building because this was the Bureau of Proclamation. Whether it was raining or snowing, the outside of the Bureau of Proclamation building always seemed to be shrouded in a layer of faint light. This phenomenon covered the already mysterious Bureau of Proclamation with a layer of strange and gaudy clothing. It even attracted the fanatical worship of some scientific sections. Some curious civilian scientists wrote an analysis in a small weekly magazine. This was because the Federal Central Computer used too much power and too much data flow, which led to some weak ionization phenomena in the air around the Bureau of Proclamation. Therefore, it was very easy to produce astronomical phenomena such as rainbows. The staff of the Bureau of Proclamation naturally did not care about this. Their work schedule was actually not much different from that of ordinary government officials. It was only because they had to conform to the work program of the Central Computer deep underground that their work style appeared to be calmer and more peaceful. But today, the old voice in the Bureau of Proclamation Director's office was full of emotion and an unknown emotion. It had nothing to do with the words calm and peaceful. "I've always been pretending to be calm. Since more than 2 years ago, when the first alarm in this building sounded, I've been pretending." The old director of the Bureau of Proclamation stared at the file on the hologram expressionlessly. He stared at the young man squinting in the file and said, "When the alarm sounded, I went to play golf. I didn't participate in the joint conference. That was because I kept trying to convince myself that I didn't know how that traitor mechanic Yufeng survived. But I'm not a fool, and I'm not a philosopher. I can't lie to myself." The old director's face was full of vicissitudes. Other than the Empire, the central computer has never sounded the first alarm. Fortunately, Yufeng is dead. I'm very comforted. Chapter 345. The Bureau of Proclamation had never dealt with the small-eyed young officer, except during the presidential inauguration ceremony in the cold winter. The investigation team sent by the Bureau had cooperated with this person once, but it was not really a cooperation. It was just that both parties had the same goal for different reasons. But two people at the top of the Bureau of Proclamation were no stranger to Su Lu. Director Tai, in particular, liked this smiling young man very much, because this young man had helped the Bureau of Proclamation to survive a crisis. Before the Bureau of Proclamation was in great danger because of the slow reaction time of the bureaucrats, he had held Medellin back and even eliminated Medellin in the end. However, the subsequent development of the situation, as well as the sentimental and vigilant feelings of the old director, were all related to this trace of liking. When the report of the Medellin case was being carried out in the presidential residence, the Bureau of Proclamation already had the intention of exonerating Su Lu and Shi Qinghai. When the military god of Philadelphia stepped out to protect Su Lu and President Pabre pardoned Su Lu, Director Tai naturally had the idea of recruiting this little guy into the Bureau of Proclamation. The 720,000-word first charter ensured that the Bureau of Proclamation would not participate in the specific management and politics of human society. Even the underground central computer had to remain neutral when it came to the anti-government army, let alone the internal affairs of the Federation government and the trial of the court. But since Su Lu had been pardoned, the Bureau of Proclamation naturally had no more obstacles to recruit Su Lu. Director Tai knew that the old man had stepped out to protect Su Lu because the federal military had great use for this person. No department in the Federation dared to fight with the military for a person. Even if there was, they probably would not dare to fight with the old man in Philadelphia. But the Bureau of Proclamation had this kind of status and confidence. So for the first time, Su Lu entered the Bureau of Proclamation site. After meeting with the old man from Philadelphia at Linyuan, Lady Tai deliberated for a long time. In the end, she did not tell the Bureau of Proclamation about Su Li's secret. But once the Bureau of Proclamation began a comprehensive investigation of a certain person, even if it was based on a very positive idea, with the terrifying information-gathering ability of the central computer, it would still find countless problems. A shocking question. There were two people in the Federation. One was called Su Lu and the other was also called Su Lu. One was a top-notch engineer who had developed the MX mech, the other was an orphan miner from Donglin, the other was an apprentice of the most wanted criminal in the Federation, the other was Delius 420500481X, and the other was SLAT 510200431X. There seemed to be no relationship between these two people, except that they were both called Su Lu, and they looked very similar, like a pair of twin brothers. The Bureau of Proclamation was able to connect these two people, who were separated by tens of thousands of kilometers because of the strict identity sorting process when recruiting core staff. But the most important thing was the information calculation ability of the cloud computing model of the Federal Central Computer Underground. I'm not in the mood to play golf anymore. The old director's eyes were half closed, as if he did not want to look at Su Li's picture on the holographic screen. His voice was a bit distant and indifferent. If this little guy continues to wander outside, Chui Judong had been the assistant director of the Bureau of Proclamation for 7 years. For the last 3 years, he had been representing the Bureau of Proclamation to participate in the planning of confidential matters within the Federation. Everyone knew that after the old director retired, he would be the only candidate for the director of the Bureau of Proclamation that everyone in the Federation envied but avoided. Hearing the endless meaning in the director's words, a trace of helplessness flashed across Chui Judong's calm middle-aged face. He said, "There is no evidence." There were many core principles hidden in the first charter. Other than the absolute privacy protection of citizens, there was also a similar principle. The greater the power, the greater the ability, the more rules one had to follow. Therefore, the Bureau of Proclamation was without a doubt the most law-abiding place in the Federation. It was also the most law-abiding place. A long time ago, the Tai dynasty's royal palace was probably the same. Perhaps later on, those emperors gradually forgot the spirit of the first charter, which was why they drifted away in the long river of history. The Bureau of Proclamation now deeply suspected that the two Su Lu with different citizen ID numbers were the same person. This represented an extremely terrifying inference, but the problem was that they had no evidence. No, for Director Ng and Assistant Chui Judong in the office, this was not even a suspicion, but an irrefutable fact. This was because the Bureau of Proclamation had obtained the biological markers of the two Su Lu through some secret channel. The biological marker of Su Lu in Donglin was the file of medical welfare for the orphan miners before the Federation of Crystal Mines went bankrupt. The biological marker of Su Lu in Shanglin was some of the remnant samples left behind when the General Hospital of the 2nd Military Region rescued Su Lu after the terrorist attack on the S2 Foundation building. However, this kind of evidence obtained through non-legal procedures could not be considered evidence in the eyes of the law and the internal regulations of the Bureau of Proclamation. It could not even be presented. In fact, if the significance of this matter was not so frightening, Director Ng would not have used this method at all. In fact, even if evidence of the biological marker was found, it still needed to be provided to the central computer for judgment. Therefore, in short, the Bureau of Proclamation had already begun to suspect Su Lu, but there was nothing they could do unless the central computer made a judgment and sent out an alarm. "I think this matter should be reported to Vice President Byron," Chui Judong sincerely suggested to his superior with a heavy expression. According to the law of the Federation, the Vice President was also the chairman of the Administrative Committee of the Federation. He was a bridge between the President and the Parliament, and was also the only big shot in the political structure of the Federation who could deeply influence the Bureau of Proclamation. However, due to certain political habits, for countless years, the Vice President of the Federation rarely asked about the specific work of the Bureau of Proclamation. On the contrary, they would deliberately keep a distance. Everyone understood why. The old director was silent for a long time before he slowly shook his head and said, "If Su Lu has really entered an abnormal state, then he will be the 72nd. According to the law of the first abnormal state, the only people who can access this information are President Pabre, me and Marshal Li." He coughed twice before he looked at Chui Judong and said, "Actually, you shouldn't know about this, but I'm going to retire next year. These things have to be passed on to you, so there's no harm in hearing about it." "Marshal Li? I never knew that the military could interfere with the operation of the Bureau of Proclamation. You have to know that even the President can't," Chui Judong said with surprise. Chui Judong said with some surprise. Of course, he respected the old man in Philadelphia very much, but he also knew how terrible the abnormal situation confirmed by the Federation's central computer was. He always felt that something was wrong. When my predecessor passed this to me, he mentioned the abnormal state. The first abnormal state in the Federation was discovered by Marshal Li himself, and he reported it to the Bureau of Proclamation, old Director Tai said expressionlessly. I already called Philadelphia 3 days ago. Chui Judong asked with anticipation. What did the old man say on the phone? The old director didn't answer but fell into a long silence. On that phone call, the response he got was, Su Lu didn't enter an abnormal state, he was just affected by the previous abnormal state. Things weren't as serious as the Bureau of Proclamation thought. The glory of the charter that spread across the universe wasn't challenged again. The thing that the Bureau of Proclamation was most worried about had been eliminated forever with that person's death. The most important mission for the Bureau of Proclamation now was to dig out the seeds that the Empire had spread. The Bureau of Proclamation was an absolutely independent organization. Even with the personal guarantee of the Federation's God of War, the old director still couldn't relax because this was the most important danger that could break the glory of the charter. His slightly squinted eyes showed the steadiness and persistence of the building. He broke the silence and said slowly, Old man, you still haven't come to a conclusion? Chui Judong shook his head and immediately began to rub his forehead. It seemed like he had a headache. The old director's face became really ugly. According to the spirit of the charter, the Federal Central Computer would never stop a crime because logically and legally speaking, it would lead to a huge problem that was difficult to solve. Even if they investigated Senator Medellin and found out about the Empire's seed plan, the Central Computer would still automatically generate an investigation report and submit it to the Bureau of Proclamation for processing. Even at the beginning of the investigation, the Bureau of Proclamation would need to give the authority to the investigation. The only exception was the first sequence of events, and in the history of the past 1,000 years, the first sequence of events had only appeared a few times. The first time was the invasion of the Empire, and the other times were related to the traitorous pilot called Yufeng. The staff of the Bureau of Proclamation were the authority examiners and the servers of the Central Computer. They began to suspect Su Lu, but the Central Computer never determined that this was an abnormal situation, and they had no way to submit a report to the government. The two people in the office had been waiting for the Central Computer's reaction. Just like 3 years ago, the old man underground had directly determined the first sequence of events and taken over the corresponding authority. Then, he would have transferred a warship from the West Woods to kill the other party with one shot. It would not be like now where there was suspicion but no evidence, investigation but no results, and watching the other party with a strong hidden danger but unable to do anything. Why can't the old man come to a conclusion? It's obvious that Su Li's problem can be determined by a human with a monkey-like brain. The wrinkles on the old director's face became extremely deep, filled with countless questions and worries at the deepest level. The Bureau of Proclamation wanted to recruit Su Lu. During the final review process, it was the Federal Central Computer Underground that discovered the relevant suspicious points. However, when it was time to actually carry out the core steps of the security level and sequence determination, the Federal Central Computer encountered a huge problem. Old Director Tai and Chui Judong looked at each other and saw the deep uneasiness and doubt in each other's eyes. They both thought of the 7 seconds on that day, the 7 seconds that shocked the 1,300 core staff of the Bureau of Proclamation both above and below ground. The 7 seconds that were like the loss of their parents, the 7 seconds that were the most panicked in the history of the Bureau of Proclamation, the 7 seconds of silence and pain that were like the rebirth of the world. The Federal Central Computer, which was attached to the underground computing core and the electronic monitoring network of the entire universe, had been operating steadily and silently since the day it was born. It had been tens of thousands of years, and perhaps would continue for tens of thousands of years, but there had never been a moment of stagnation. However, on that day, it suddenly experienced a 7-second crash. Okay, the weak me can still write the second chapter at this time. I admit that I am indeed very good and very strong, just like the old man. Chapter 346. Any computer would crash. The users would most likely use this time to make a cup of coffee or tea, rest for a while with their legs crossed, and wait for the choose system's indifferent welcome to ring out. No one would treat this as something that would shock the world and make the gods weep. However, the central computer deep underground in the Bureau of Proclamation would not crash. It had not been rebooted for countless years. Therefore, on that day in early autumn, when the enormous 2D light screen suddenly turned black, and all the sub-processing workstations fell into a dead silence, the entire Bureau of Proclamation was dumbfounded. The word dumbfounded was not enough to describe the scene and emotions at that time. From the director to the most basic data analysts, everyone stared at the darkness and listened to the silence. They felt like the star that always shone on the Capitol ring had suddenly gone out, and the billions of stars in the universe had suddenly disappeared without a trace. The Federal Central Computer had stopped working. No one knew what this meant for the Federation and human society better than the employees of the Bureau of Proclamation. They knew that once the central computer was lost, the people of the Imperium could easily launch a large-scale attack. There was no need for the invaders of the Imperium to attack at all. The vast territory of the Federation would be torn apart because of the loss of its most powerful central force. The entire human society would fall apart. What would become of human beings when they lost the glory of the Constitution? No one dared to think about this terrifying question. In the face of the sudden darkness and silence, more than 1,000 employees of the Bureau of Proclamation above and below ground were silent. Some of them put their hands together, and some of the female employees even shed tears of fear and helplessness. This kind of extremely shocking accident made everyone's heart almost unable to bear it. They did not know if the Federal Central Computer, the existence that they affectionately called Old Thing, had truly reached the end of its life, or if it was just taking a nap and would wake up soon. This was not like losing one's parents. This was more sorrowful than losing one's family. This was not the shock of spring thunder. This was more powerful than thunder and lightning. Thankfully, the central computer deep below the ground did not pause for long. After 13,221 seconds, a tiny bright spot appeared at the center of the wide, dark light beam. Then, this bright spot suddenly exploded, radiating countless blazing white lines. In just an instant, it illuminated the vast underground space, as if countless nebulas were spreading, condensing, and disappearing. However, this time period was too short, and it was impossible to distinguish with the naked eye. Even the fastest video control system could not detect it. After the light, it was quiet and normal. Countless images from every corner of the Federation appeared on the light beam again. Countless messages flashed quickly in order in a complicated and incomprehensible machine language. However, the lines seemed to be flashing faster than usual. A mechanical voice sounded. Upgrade complete. Other than that, everything was normal. It was as if nothing had happened. It was as if those 7 seconds had never happened. When the Federal Central Computer fell into darkness, the people of the Bureau of Proclamation thought that the whole world had collapsed. When it returned to normal, they suddenly felt that this beautiful world had been reborn. In the ancient myths before the catastrophe, it seemed that a certain creator took 7 days to create this bizarre world. However, the God in the hearts of the people of the Bureau of Proclamation only took 7 seconds to rebuild the world in their hearts. 7 seconds was too short. The shock, fear, and despair on the faces of many of the employees had just started to ripple. Many of the female employees' tears had just flowed a centimeter before the process was over. Their emotions instantly fell into an indescribable state of emptiness. The Federal Central Computer Underground of the Bureau of Proclamation, according to the rules of the Constitution, would self-upgrade. However, the people of the Federation who were still alive today had never witnessed this scene with their own eyes. Furthermore, according to the records left behind in the manual, the Federal Central Computer's upgrade required an extremely long period of time. The hardware and related supporting software would gradually self-upgrade. No one had ever thought that this old thing would suddenly take a nap and frighten countless people. Then, when it opened its eyes again, it coldly announced that the upgrade was successful. What kind of upgrade was this? No one knew. The unexpected crash or self-upgrade of the Federal Central Computer this time was manually listed as a second-order incident. It was strictly confidential. Other than the core employees of the Bureau of Proclamation, only President Pabre and Vice President Byron knew about it. Even those on Parliament Hill had no idea what kind of soul-stirring 7 seconds the Bureau of Proclamation had experienced. It took a long time for the Bureau of Proclamation to shake off the shock and complicated emotions. However, there was still a certain question in everyone's heart, a certain shadow of unknown color that kept floating and floating. The old director and Cui Judong's eyes met briefly before naturally looking away. It was as if they did not want to further recall and analyze those 7 seconds. As the 2 senior officials who had worked the longest in the Bureau of Proclamation, had the highest authority, and understood the central computer the most, they had already developed a certain understanding in their life of monotonous work. The level of civilization represented by the underground central computer had always been higher than the average level of civilization in the Federation society. Just the fact that the central computer could self-upgrade was the crystallization of wisdom left behind by the great group of 5 for human society was something that the current scientific system could not achieve. Before the catastrophe, human civilization had developed to an astonishing level. Although for tens of thousands of years, human beings had been constantly improving and catching up, and had probably even surpassed their predecessors in certain aspects, in the end, they still could not recover their past glory in certain core aspects. Old Director Tai reached out and listed all the files on Su Lu on the light screen as top secret. He sat in the chair silently for a long time. When he thought of the Human Resource Planning Commission under the Bureau of Proclamation and those factories, he could not help but feel a certain kind of emotion. After so many years, the Bureau of Proclamation was still just that old thing's service staff. They knew what they should know, but they could never understand what they did not have the ability to understand. Living with the crystallization of a huge mechanical civilization that was as vast as the stars and witnessing its extraordinary abilities, in a weird organization like the Constitutional Bureau, many of the staff would be imperceptibly influenced. They were not followers of the Church of Science, but somewhere in the deepest part of their hearts, they went against the scientific spirit they should have and were extremely superstitious. They believed and worshipped the central computer obsessively. They saw the cold machine as the spirit of the Federation, as the last remnant of the great civilization of the previous generation. As the service staff who looked after this remnant, they also felt infinite glory and pride for it. This kind of superstition came from the worship of the level of wisdom that humans could reach themselves, from the dazzling deeds of the glory of the Charter over countless years, and from the principle that machines would never make mistakes. The staff of the Bureau of Proclamation were superstitious about it, worshipped it, and believed in it as family. That was why they called it the old thing. The old director was no exception. He silently looked at the rapidly flashing mechanical words on the light screen. Suddenly, he lost all interest in investigating Su Li's identity. Since the old thing was still unwilling to determine the identity of this person, there had to be its own precise and irreversible logical reasons. There was an unwritten rule within the Bureau of Proclamation. This rule did not seem to conform to the spirit of the Charter, but it had been deeply ingrained in the hearts of every staff of this independent organization for countless years. They could not and did not want to resist. This rule was: 1. The old thing would never make a mistake. 2. If the old thing made a mistake, please refer to the first rule. From the first day I entered the Bureau, I've been thinking about a question. The old director gave up thinking and picked up the golf club from behind the chair again. He sighed and said, I don't know if the old thing is alive or not. When Chui Judong heard this, he felt a chill run down his back. It was so cold that it was painful. In fact, this was probably the question that every staff who had worked in the Bureau of Proclamation for a long time would have, because the central computer deep underground was too omnipotent, even though it had never shown any human emotions. When I was at the 7th Research Institute, I studied this in my doctoral thesis. After a moment of silence, Chui Judong said, according to the core logic program of the old thing and the charter designed by the 5-person team, if it really produces a thought pattern similar to carbon-based life, it will directly self-destruct. As if he felt that this was not enough to calm his wavering heart, Chui Judong quickly added, and from a philosophical point of view, this does not make sense. That's true. The old director coughed twice and opened his somewhat listless eyes. He walked out of the office with the golf club and said, "And what does this have to do with us? It will live for millions or even hundreds of millions of years, but we will all die in the end. I have never doubted that even if the entire Federation is destroyed, the old thing will still exist until the end of the universe. If that's the case, we don't have the right to talk about it." Probably only the staff of the Bureau of Proclamation, who had worked for the Federal Central Computer for their entire lives, could talk about this kind of thing so casually. This was because their lives and even breathing were connected to the cold computing machine underground. They had a natural sense of intimacy. However, if this conversation in the Bureau of Proclamation was leaked, it would cause a lot of trouble. In fact, Director Jean and Chui Judong's assistant were only talking about it in general. They didn't have the ability to investigate the 7-second problem, and they didn't know that the Federation's central computer had suddenly crashed. It was only because when it was investigating Su Li's true identity, it encountered a logic problem that made it feel difficult. At the same time, it came into contact with a trace of something that made its mechanical program somewhat uncomfortable. After the 7-second crash, the Federal Central Computer was rebooted. No one noticed that at the end of the last sentence, there was a symbol that represented a smiley face. "Sorry, I overestimated myself. It's hard to bear, and writing is not going well. That's all for today. I need to rest and recover first. I really hope that everyone will give me a few monthly votes. This has nothing to do with the update. The monthly votes have been exceeded, but I still don't have the energy. This is related to the body, but it is also related to the mind. Writing a book requires the accumulation of murderous intent, accumulating momentum, and needing everyone's encouragement, allowing me to rest and then rush forward. This is very much in need of everyone's mental support." Chapter 347. The 7 seconds during which the Federal Central Computer crashed, or rather upgraded, were precisely the 7 seconds during which Su Lu was in the mountains behind the base, calling out affectionately but receiving no reply, causing him to break out in cold sweat. As a mechanical intelligence that did not have a physical body but calmly observed the entire human society, the reason why there was a problem when investigating Su Li's true identity and confirming his level was because there was an unavoidable problem in the core of its program. This program problem was Su Lu. Over the countless years, the glory of the charter left behind by the 5-man team had only discovered 71 abnormal situations and 1 suspected abnormal situation. These abnormal situations were all determined by the central computer as first-order event. It should be known that in its long life, there had been no other first-order events other than the invasion of the Empire that it had determined. According to the standard procedures for dealing with abnormal situations, the Federal Central Computer would send out a request to contact the abnormal situation. If the other party refused, it would submit a report to the government for handling, or use its own core authority to directly and silently erase the abnormal situation. Initiating contact required a certain level of intrusion into the human brain. This method completely violated the first charter and was extremely dangerous. Anyone who accepted the initiating contact would have to allow a machine to probe and even influence their brain, and even obtain the opportunity to control their own life and death through the chip at the back of their neck. The owner of the 71 abnormal situations, that astonishingly talented uncle who wandered the stars, coldly rejected the call from the glory of the charter. Thus, he became the Federation's most wanted criminal, causing countless explosions and manhunt. In that dark dream, almost subconsciously, Sulu accepted the initiating contact request from the charter computer. From that moment on, Sulu became the first living being in history to be able to communicate with the central computer in a two-way manner. Today, the central computer had an almost absolute probability of inferring that citizen number SLAT 510200431X Sulu, a citizen of the Federation, was the suspected abnormal situation that it had stored in the core file 3 years ago. The word suspected could even be completely removed. In the dark dream, Sulu accepted the initiating contact request. The central computer no longer generated reports to the government and calmly observed him for a long time. But now that it had determined that he was the 72nd abnormal situation, according to the hidden highest authority in the core program of the central computer, it should not hesitate to destroy Su Li's existence, leaving no trace in history. Because such a loophole as an abnormal situation was very likely to threaten the glory of the charter or the collapse of the social structure designed by the five-man team. But miraculously, in Su Li's body, the energy that was similar to a biological microcurrent violently attacked the disguise chip at the back of his neck, triggering a certain backdoor. Any citizen who entered an abnormal situation would be the first target to be eliminated by the central computer underground of the Bureau of Proclamation. But when the backdoor that had been hidden for tens of thousands of years was activated, the command that the central computer had to execute was, observe the status of the person to be contacted and inform the five-man team. The five-man team had been dead for tens of thousands of years. How could they be notified? For the omniscient and omnipotent charter computer, this was still a difficult problem. It had read all the ancient religious classics and bizarre magical literature that existed in this world, but it still could not extend a tentacle from its body made of machinery and electrons to the abyss that did not exist to summon the 5 irresponsible sages to deal with this problem. Therefore, the central computer could only observe Su Lu, generate top-secret observation reports, and wait for tens of billions of years later, when the universe died out or rewound, when even entropy began to become chaotic, when time might rewind, and the 5 fellows who had long been in peace would crawl out of the ground again. But before these impossible things happened, the Federal Central Computer at least had to ensure one thing, and that was that the target of its observation must be alive so that it could continue to observe. This was a very simple logical inference. The Federal Central Computer was not a golden finger left to Su Lu by the Creator. It would never violate the Federation's laws and the spirit of the Charter to handle any affairs for the Naked Ape, unless the Naked Ape's request was legal and reasonable, but it could not let Su Lu die. So in the desperate situation of the Foundation building, Su Li's left eye suddenly could use its power to see ghosts, see light, and see everything. It was just that it had to ensure the biological survival of the observation target. Citizen Su Lu was the first target to be eliminated, and Citizen Su Lu was the first target to be protected. The first charter, which was hundreds of thousands of words, made an extremely precise division at all levels of authority, blocking any logical fallacies. Even if the central computer was faced with 2 completely opposite instructions of the same sequence at the same time, it could still make its own judgment mechanically and calmly within a billionth of a second. But in the face of Su Li's program problem, the central computer could not make its own judgment. It was still the same old saying. All of this gave people headaches, and the source of the central computer's annoyance to the point of crashing was because the 5-person team that left a backdoor in the chip behind the human neck and instructions in its core program were 5 very irresponsible guys. The Federal Central Computer had existed for a long time and had been upgraded independently for a long time, but its core was still the same simple, even shabby, binary principle from the earliest days. In a certain ancient philosophical debate, this principle was somewhat similar to the existence and absence of contrast at the beginning of the world. For it, Su Li's program problem was the problem of 0 and 1, the problem of life and death, the problem of Tobe and not Tobe, the problem of right and wrong. These problems seem to be the simplest and most basic, but in fact, the simpler and more basic things were often the most complex and profound. No one knew what happened in the 7 seconds of the military exercise and the 7 seconds of the central computer's pause. What people did not know was that the Federation's central computer, which could simultaneously monitor countless planets, was suffering from a form of schizophrenia in the face of such a small problem. Countless core program data streams were rapidly calculating, colliding, distinguishing, processing, or perhaps thinking in the computing core's deep underground, in the streams of data fragments in space, on the microcircuits of every approved chip, and in every place imaginable to humans. They were rapidly calculating, colliding, distinguishing, processing, or perhaps thinking. The Federal Central Computer was operating almost crazily, directly leading to a crash. 7 seconds of time, for the universe, was just a moment, but for it, which was operating at a high speed, it was like countless centuries had passed. During the temporary pause of this once-in-a-lifetime, the glory of the charter, the tiny 66-byte information fragment that it had extracted from the camouflage chip behind Su Li's neck a long time ago suddenly entered its core program. This was the information remnant attached to the camouflage chip. At this time, it finally exploded in the computing core of the central computer. This information remnant that came from Feng Yu's hands, but no one knew where it came from, was like a ray of light that illuminated a certain darkness. Vaguely, one side that had simply divided the universe into 2 had won. Some of the restraints that were branded in its core program were broken, and some very strange things began to grow. People only knew that the central computer had been upgraded, and that its operation was faster and smoother than before. However, no one noticed that at the end of that line of program, this cold mechanical intelligence had left a rather human-like smiley face. And Su Lu, who had felt the different mischievous emotions of the old thing in the MX mecha back then, should have been the one to directly see the problem. Unfortunately, at that time, he was focused on breaking into the Iron 7th Division's camp, and thus missed the opportunity to remember the most shocking moment of human society. All of this was just the beginning. The road ahead was exceptionally long. The autumn was deep and the yellow leaves fell. Su Lu sat on a bench in the charter square, narrowing his eyes as he looked at the statues of the 5-person team in the middle of the square. He stared at the face of the middle-aged woman beside the statues, and couldn't help but feel a strong sense of curiosity. Among the 5-person team that led humanity out of the catastrophe and rebuilt society, why was the one who was regarded as a computer genius a woman? The mother of the glory of the charter. He laughed out loud, and asked the omnipresent central computer through the chip behind his neck, "She's your mother? Then wouldn't I have to call her old grandmother?" He didn't know how the central computer in the Bureau of Proclamations basement had changed because of his program problem. On this autumn square, he was just like before, chatting with the old thing as if he was chatting with his family. Today was a rest day, but strangely, there was basically no one in the charter square. Even the usual crowd of tourists had disappeared. A screen in the corner of the square was broadcasting live news. Above the stone steps of the Parliament building, President Pabre of the Federation, Vice President Byron, and the Deputy Chairman of the Management Committee were welcoming the arrival of a person. The man's hair was white and his skin was dark. He wore a simple and plain military uniform, but it wasn't the official uniform of the Federation. But in front of these big shots of the Federation, the aura this man displayed was in no way inferior. This was because his name was Nan Shui, and he was the highest leader of the anti-government forces. He led his troops in the vast Green Dragon Mountains, and fought against the Federation government for many years. President Pabre smiled slightly, and took the initiative to walk down the stairs, extending his broad and powerful hand. The leader of Nan Shui was slightly startled, and then a smile appeared on his face, and he gripped the hand firmly. When the two hands firmly grasped each other, a burst of extremely enthusiastic applause came from the screen, and then the thunderous applause and cheers from the Parliament Mountain not far away also spread to the quiet Charter Square. The great reconciliation of the Federation has finally set foot on the official agenda, Su Lu thought emotionally as he sat on the bench. There's more at night. These few chapters were originally the most troublesome, and I was the most mentally retarded, but they were also the things that had to be written. Chapter 348. The political negotiations between the Federation government and Green Dragon Mountain had mostly come to an end. Both sides had reached a broad consensus, which was why this handshake in front of the Parliament's mountain gate was possible. The political prisoners locked up in the prison were all released, and the exchange of prisoners of war accumulated over the past 7 years had long been completed. Only a portion of the issues related to the George Carlin Youth Army were still in dispute. Over the past few years, the federal government had been accusing the Green Dragon Mountain of inciting the youth through kidnapping and brainwashing. Furthermore, the federal government had targeted the 300 missing persons cases against the Green Dragon Mountain. During the negotiations, the government demanded that the anti-government forces of the Green Dragon Mountain immediately hand over the youths and let them return to their warm homes. However, the Green Dragon Mountain insisted that the youths had entered the mountain voluntarily. They had been inspired by the ideals of the George Carlinism and the anti-government forces, so they had resolutely left their homes. Because it involved many angry parents, the Federation government did not make any clear concessions during the negotiations. However, these small differences could not stop the entire Federation from calling for unity and jointly resisting the Empire's surging momentum. Relevant negotiations continued, and other aspects had long begun to develop in a good direction. Before this historic handshake, the anti-government army had already accepted the government's proposed peace plan. The leader of Nanshui refused the proposal to enter the Federation Management Committee as an honorary chairman, and even coldly refused the position of vice president that Mr. Byron had so generously and farsightedly offered. He chose to return to Green Dragon Mountain and live in seclusion after the negotiations, but agreed that a considerable portion of the anti-government army would be reorganized into the government army. This portion of the anti-government army would be transferred to the 1st Military Region, and in the extremely short future, they would be thrown into the fiery front lines of the West Woods region. The Nanshui leader and the anti-government Central Committee firmly believed that this was the only way to send a sufficiently clear message to the entire Federation. Green Dragon Mountain was willing to reconcile with the government, not because of any political or benefit considerations, but only to resist the Empire's bloody invasion. These weren't just words, but also what they were about to do. Unlike last year's presidential election, Su Lu knew nothing about the political changes in the upper echelons of the Federation. During that time, he had always been locked up in the Black Prison or training officers in the base. The reason he was sitting in Charter Square today was because he was waiting for a piece of good news that he had been waiting for a long time. Through the training exercises in the base, Su Lu proved his value to the upper echelons of the Federation government. The relevant departments finally softened their attitude in the face of his persistent application. Of course, more importantly, because of the current political climate in the Federation, the presidential residence finally issued an amnesty document signed by President Pabre, the Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Defense. There was a sea of people in front of Parliament Hill, but the Charter Square was somewhat quiet and lonely. Su-Lu narrowed his eyes as he watched the real-time picture on the light beam. Listening to the thunderous applause and President Pabre's firm words, he was somewhat absent-minded for a moment. A dark green military vehicle drove over from the west side of the street. It was about 20 meters away from the bench where Su-Lu was sitting, but it could not go any further. This was because at some point in time, in the corner of Charter Square, there suddenly appeared a few calm and strong men. They blocked in front of Su-Lu and stopped the military vehicle. After leaving the base and starting their vacation, Team 7 still left 6 people around Su-Lu as a security force. Although Su-Lu was the highest director of Team 7, the arrangement of the Ministry of Defense was still a little surprising. At this time, the few men blocking the military vehicle were the armed members of Team 7 led by Xiong Linquan. Major Lan Xiaolong appeared behind Su Li's bench, glanced at the hand signal from Xiong Linquan, nodded, and whispered in Su Li's ear, "No problem." Su Lu shook his head, got up and walked to the military vehicle, and said, "The pardon order has been issued. The government can't go back on their words. Besides, even if they want to go back on their words, why bother with me? This is the order of the Ministry of Defense. Your safety is the focus of our work." Lan Xiaolong shrugged, followed behind him and said, "Besides, this friend of yours is not an ordinary person who knows what accidents might happen. It's never wrong to be careful." At this time, the side door of the dark green military vehicle opened, and a man walked out of the vehicle. His cheeks were pale, and his hair was messy in the autumn wind. Only that pair of peach blossom eyes and that beautiful and handsome face did not seem to be worn away by nearly a year in prison. After the handsome and haggard man got out of the vehicle, he looked up at the sky, completely ignoring the lively news on the light screen behind him. He took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and seemed to be extremely intoxicated. Looking at this scene, Su-Lu silently quickened his pace and walked toward him, but in his heart, he was thinking about the news from the Shishan compound. It was said that in the negotiations between the government and the anti-government army, there was no such arrangement. It was the legendary anti-government army intelligence leader who personally proposed the conditions to the Government Federation's investigation director. If it was not for this guy would probably continue to be locked up. The last time the two sat in the pool of Senator Macklin's blood, smoking and listening to the sound of the bell, it was almost a year ago. 2 months ago, the Federation government restarted the Macklin project. This seed of the empire, the shrewd senator, was still not at peace after his death, and gradually, the Federation stripped him of his bright exterior. Macklin died, Macklin stinked, Pabre became the president, Nanshui came to the capital, and the Federation was reconciled. It was said that a few days ago, the former president of the Federal Academy of Science, Lin Yuanhu, died quietly. The world always changed so quickly that the people in it did not have time to feel the relationship between the sea and the field before they realized that they were no longer in the same place. The dark green military vehicle drove away silently. The amnesty of the Federation government was always so quiet. No one wanted this kind of political transaction to be exposed to the public. Su-Lu walked up to him and looked him up and down with narrowed eyes. He took out a pack of 37 cigarettes from the pocket of his military uniform and put one between Macklin's dry and thin lip. Carefully blocking the wind with his hand, he lit it seriously. With a hiss, the flame on the end of the cigarette lit up brightly, retreating quickly like the burning twilight on the plains. Shi Qinghai took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and furrowed his brows. He seemed to be in pain, but he seemed to be enjoying it, but he was silent for a long time. After a while, he took the cigarette out from between his lips and handed it to Su-Lu. Su-Lu took it and also took a deep drag. He choked and coughed a few times. With a slightly hoarse voice he said, You've lost a bit of weight, but other than that, you haven't changed much. Of course. Shi Qinghai looked at Su Lu with a smile and said, You should know better than anyone what kind of person I am. How did you survive 5 months in the black prison? Su Lu handed the cigarette over and took one for himself. This was the question he was most worried about in the past few months. When he was in the Fox Fortress, the old man chatted with him and played porn for him. But how did Shi Qinghai survive those cold and silent years by himself? I'm a professional. Shi Qinghai smiled, but his smile was a bit fierce. Perhaps even he didn't want to recall those dark days. After a pause, he continued, I didn't suffer much in the past few months, probably after you were pardoned. In fact, I even made a few acquaintances in the black prison of the Fox Fortress. You're indeed fiercer than me, Su Lu said seriously. The autumn wind gradually rose. In the quiet Charter Square, there was only the sound of President Pabre's speech on the screen and the two men whispering to each other. Lan Xiaolong, Xiong Linquan, and the rest of the 6 people stood not far away, vigilantly watching the surroundings. However, they clearly heard the conversation between Su Lu and Shi Qinghai. At this time, they had a rough idea that Su Lu had learned to call himself young master in class from this man. However, in their opinion, he was very qualified to call himself young master, since he had graduated with the best grades from No. 1 Academy, an excellent spy who traveled between the government and the anti-government army, and an awesome person who had assassinated Macklin. During the days when I was locked up, I always thought that if I could get out, I must meet someone. Guess who it is? Shi Qinghai had lit his second cigarette at this time. He squatted by the side of the street and said. Su Lu also squatted down and replied, I don't think it's me. You're not good-looking. Shi Qinghai smiled slightly. That pair of mesmerizing peach blossom eyes gradually bloomed in the autumn wind, revealing a trace of intoxicating longing and yearning. I've already made the arrangements. Su Lu lowered his head and said, She will bring Lu Hua to see you tonight. The autumn wind was similarly bleak in front of the Shishan compound. The soldiers standing guard at the entrance and the aura of the compound of iron and blood made this bleak atmosphere even more intense. Zhou was wearing a black windbreaker today, carrying the real Lu Hua in her arms. The cold expression between her eyebrows was particularly clear and piercing because of the change in color of her clothes. The facial features of this minister's daughter always gave off a feeling of being bright and beautiful. When it came to beauty, she was really beautiful to the extreme. However, whether it was in front of people or behind the scenes, whether it was the red-clothed girl back then or the beautiful mother now, most of the time, her straight eyebrows always gave off a sense of coolness. In front of Su Lu, she actually no longer deliberately acted as a character. However, on this occasion, she put on this mask again. Su Lu walked out of the black car and smiled slightly at her. His gaze caught a trace of red from the collar of her windbreaker, the kind that was so bright that it was somewhat piercing to the eyes. The car started moving. Zhou sat in the passenger's seat and broke the silence at an unexpected point. Her voice was extremely cold. My family thinks that I'm going out to eat with you. When you bring me back later, don't let it slip. I'm just going to see an old friend. Why make it seem like I'm going to war? Su Lu looked ahead and said. The black car stopped below a high-class apartment in the south city of the capital. Su Lu carried the child and walked into the elevator with Zhou. The elevator only opened when it reached the top floor. Su Lu looked at Zhou, who was walking towards the room, and felt a tinge of warmth in his heart. He softly instructed Xiong Linquan, who had been guarding here, about some safety matters. Just as he was about to leave, Zhou suddenly turned around and said in an indifferent tone that left no room for doubt, Come and pick me up in an hour. Su Lu was slightly stunned before nodding. Yes, there's another chapter later. There's no rush to say goodbye today. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.